Rhett Callahan's laugh was the kind that filled a room and drained it at the same time. It started the moment the old man walked through the saloon doors, a low, mean chuckle that spread from his mouth to Boone Mercer's grin to Eli Rusk's smirk like fire catching dry grass. Three young men with matching confidence and matching pistols, and they had nothing better to do on a Thursday afternoon than find someone smaller to stand on. The old man didn't look up. That was what made Rhett laugh harder. He just walked to the bar, set his hat on the stool beside him, and said whiskey. Cheap is fine. Rhett was already moving before the bartender could pour. He stepped in front of the man, not blocking him exactly, just making himself impossible to ignore, and tilted his head the way a boy does when he wants to seem older than he is. "You ride far?" Rhett asked. "Far enough," the old man said. "You look it." The other two laughed. Someone at the corner table shifted his chair, putting distance between himself and whatever was about to happen. The bartender set the glass down and found something to do at the far end of the counter. The old man picked up his whiskey. He didn't answer. That should have been a warning. A man who doesn't defend himself to strangers either has nothing to prove, or has already proven everything that matters. But Rhett Callahan was 23 years old and had won 14 straight shooting contests in 4 counties, and he had not yet learned the difference between silence that means weakness and silence that means patience. He reached out and flicked the brim of the old man's hat off the stool. It hit the floor. Nobody moved. The old man looked at it. Then he looked at Rhett. His eyes were the color of old creek water, not brown, not green, something in between, something that had seen too many seasons to commit to either. He had a face like weathered fence posts, not ugly, just used. A jaw that hadn't met a razor in 4 or 5 days. Hands that were wide and still. "You gonna pick that up?" Rhett said. Eventually, the old man said. Rhett's smile stayed, but something behind it shifted. He hadn't expected that answer. He'd expected anger or submission, the two responses he knew how to handle. This was neither. Before he could decide what to do next, the old man set his glass on the bar, bent slowly, picked up his hat, and set it back on the stool. Then he picked up his whiskey again, as if the whole exchange had been nothing more than wind through a door crack. Rhett looked at Boone. Boone looked at Eli. The saloon had gone quiet the way saloons do when the air changes and everyone present feels it before they understand it. "What's your name, old-timer?" Rhett asked. "Silas," the man said. "That all? Just Silas? That's enough." He had ridden into Larkspur that morning with a cattle tracking job waiting on the other side of it. 3 days of riding, one night camped in the open, with nothing but a wool blanket and a fire that kept dying, and a left knee that had started its daily argument with him somewhere around mile 40. He was 51 years old, which wasn't ancient by any reasonable accounting, but which felt older than it should have because of what those 51 years had contained. He'd taken the job from a rancher named Aldous Pope, who had a herd of 62 cattle that had drifted off during a river crossing and hadn't been recovered. Pope had heard Silas could track. Pope had been right. But the tracking didn't start until tomorrow morning, which meant Silas had a free afternoon, a deep thirst, and no particular interest in making friends or enemies. He'd wanted the whiskey. He'd wanted the chair. That was the whole of his ambition for the day. He hadn't wanted trouble, and he was sitting in a saloon full of it. Larkspur was the kind of Wyoming town that had grown fast in the boom years and hadn't quite figured out what it was during the quieter ones. The main street was wide and dusty. The buildings were half finished or half falling. The saloon, called the Buckhorn, though the actual buck's head above the door had lost one antler and looked permanently confused, was the most solid structure in town, which said something about where the money went. There were maybe 30 people inside when Silas arrived. Miners, ranchers, a card game in the back that had been running since noon. 2 women at a table near the window who were not there for the whiskey. Ordinary frontier commerce. The kind of afternoon that should pass without anyone remembering it. Then Rhett fired his pistol at the ceiling. Not for any particular reason. Just to make noise, the way young men sometimes do when the quiet starts to feel like an insult. The shot put a hole in a rafter and sent dust raining down on 3 card players, who swore loudly and brushed their hats. Boone and Eli howled with laughter. Silas had not flinched. That was the first thing that caught Rhett's attention. He'd been watching the new arrival from the moment he walked in, the way young wolves watch older ones trying to decide whether there was any threat worth calculating. The old man walked like someone accustomed to uneven ground, deliberate, weight forward, no wasted motion. His coat was trail-worn and his boots were resoled at least twice. His revolver sat on his hip in a plain leather holster with no ornamentation, no silver, nothing to advertise. It was the most boring-looking gun Rhett had ever seen on a man who wore it like it was part of his skeleton. But the old man hadn't flinched at the gunshot. Most people did. Even men who'd heard plenty of shooting flinched on reflex. It was just the body doing what bodies did. This one hadn't. He just turned toward the bar and kept walking. That bothered Rhett more than he could have explained. So he did what he usually did when something bothered him. He poked at it. The hat thing had been an impulse. He hadn't planned it. He just wanted to see what would happen. And what had happened was nothing. And somehow that was worse. He watched Silas drink his whiskey. "You shoot?" Rhett asked. Silas looked at him again. "What kind of question is that?" "A straight one. You shoot or you just wear that iron for decoration?" "I shoot," Silas said. "How good? Good enough." Rhett spread his hands. He was performing now for Boone and Eli, for the room, for the two women near the window who had stopped talking. "See, that's what they all say. Good enough." "Good enough for what?" is what I want to know. "Good enough to plink cans? Good enough to hit a barn from inside it?" He grinned. "Or good enough to actually be worth something?" Silas set his glass down. He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment the whole room seemed to lean slightly forward, the way a crowd leans when something is about to happen, and nobody is sure what. "You got a point to this," Silas said. "It wasn't a question." Durrett said. "Contest. Silver dollar tossed in the air. You hit it, it's yours. You miss, you pay entry fee of $2 per throw. Best of 12 rounds. And if I decline, you drink your whiskey in peace and I go back to minding my own business." Rhett shrugged. Easy and false. No hard feelings. Silas looked at the glass. He looked at Rhett. He looked at the revolver on Rhett's hip ivory handle, engraved barrel, the kind of gun that cost more than most men made in a month. Then he looked at the worn faces watching from every direction. Men who had nothing invested in this except an afternoon's entertainment and a story to carry home. $3 entry, Silas said. Rhett blinked. "What?" "Your contest, your rules. But if I'm paying $3 an entry, I want 12% of the total prize pot paid out before the last round, win or lose." He paused. "I don't run games I haven't read the terms of." The room laughed, surprised. Even Boone cracked a genuine smile before catching himself. Rhett, to his credit, recovered fast. "Fine," he said. $3. You're on." They moved outside because the saloon ceiling had already taken enough damage for one afternoon, and because word spread through Larkspur the way word always spread through small towns, fast and completely, within 4 minutes of the terms being settled. By the time Rhett and Silas stepped out onto the boardwalk, there were already people gathering in the street below. Silas stood in the center of the packed dirt with his coat open and his hands at his sides, looking less like a man preparing for a shooting contest and more like a man waiting for a stagecoach. He rolled his left shoulder once, the way men do when an old ache speaks up. He did not check his weapon, he did not posture, he simply stood. Rhett stood 15 feet away, silver dollar in his right hand, his pistol in its holster. He held the coin up so the crowd could see it catch the afternoon light. "Rules are simple," Rhett announced, working the crowd now, his voice carrying to the far edges of the gathered watchers. "The dollar goes up, he draws. If he hits it, it's his. 12 rounds, we keep count honest." There was murmuring. A few bets passed hands. Boone leaned toward Eli. "This is over in 2 throws, he said quietly. "He won't even draw in time," Eli nodded, watching Silas. Then he frowned. "Why isn't he nervous? Because he's old," Boone said. "Too old to know better." Rhett looked at Silas. "Ready?" "Go ahead," Silas said. Rhett tossed the coin. It went up maybe 8 feet, a fair toss. Not easy, not impossible. The coin spun in the light, tumbling, catching sun on both faces in quick alternation. The sound Silas made drawing his revolver was not a bang. It was a whisper, the faintest slide of metal, a breath of motion, and then the gun was up and level, and the hammer fell. The crack was clean and flat and final. The coin didn't clatter when it hit the dirt. It landed with a distinct different sound, not a ring, not a clink. The sound of something that had been struck center mass and had the hole to prove it. The street went silent. One man near the front walked out and picked up the coin. He turned it over in his palm. He held it up. There was a hole through the middle of it. Not near the edge. Not through the eagle's wing. Through the middle, clean and deliberate, as if someone had sat down at a workbench and drilled it with a purpose. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Rhett stared at the coin. Then he looked at Silas. Silas had already holstered. He was standing the same way he'd been standing before. Nothing in his posture had changed. No triumph, no swagger, no acknowledgement of what he'd just done. He might have swatted a fly for all the emotion he displayed. Again, Rhett said. The second coin went higher and faster, Rhett putting frustration into the toss. It caught a gust of wind and veered slightly as it rose, an unpredictable arc that would have challenged most shooters even if they'd had a full second to track it. Silas drew and fired before it reached the peak of its climb. The crowd heard the coin before they saw it fall, a brief, bright report from the bullet connecting with spinning metal, like a single note, struck on something small and true. The dollar hit the dirt 7 feet from where it had started. The man near the front went and picked that one up too. He didn't need to hold it up this time. He just shook his head slowly, showing it to the men on either side of him. Another hole dead center. Boone said nothing now. Eli had stopped grinning. The crowd was not cheering for either contestant. It had gone into the particular quiet of people who are watching something they don't fully understand, but recognize as real. Rhett took a long breath. He reached into his vest and came out with a third silver dollar. "I want to watch your hand," he said. He was not making a joke this time. "When you draw, watch whatever you like," Silas said. Rhett tossed. This time he did watch. And what he saw, or rather what he didn't see, was the problem. He did not see Silas draw. He saw Silas standing still, and then he heard the shot, and then the coin was falling with a hole in it, and he could not account for the space between those two things. The hand had moved. The gun had come out. But the motion was so compressed, so absolute, that his eyes had simply not recorded it as separate events. Rhett had been in 14 shooting contests. He had never lost one. He had beaten men who were older, faster, more experienced, who had carried their weapons across 3 territories and wore the confidence to match. He had outdrawn all of them because he had a gift, a genuine, rare gift for speed that he had always assumed was close to the ceiling of what was possible. Watching Silas, he was learning that he had assumed wrong. 3 coins, 3 holes through the center, 3 draws he couldn't follow with his naked eye. He picked up a fourth dollar and turned it in his fingers. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" he said. It came out flatter than he intended. Less aggressive, more like a question someone asks when they actually want the answer. "Same place most men learn things," Silas said, "by having to." "By having to," Rhett repeated. He looked at the coin in his hand. "What does that mean?" "It means I didn't learn in a contest," Silas said. "And neither did the men who taught me. They were trying to live." He paused. "There's a difference." The words landed in the quiet like a stone in still water. Rhett felt something in his chest that he would not have been able to name, not quite fear, not quite shame. Something that sat between them and burned with its own specific heat. He didn't like it. He dealt with it the way he always dealt with uncomfortable things. He pushed forward. "Round 4, he said, and tossed the coin. By round 6, Rhett had lost $18 in entry fees and every coin. By round 8, he had lost $24 and something else he hadn't budgeted for, the crowd's allegiance. It happened gradually. The way seasons change, you don't notice the exact moment summer becomes something else. But one afternoon you reach for your coat without thinking about it. Crowd had started out amused at the old man's audacity. They had shifted over the first few rounds to cautious acknowledgement. Now by the 8th coin they had crossed into something different, entirely. When Silas drew, the crowd was holding its breath. When the coin fell with its clean punched hole, the exhale that followed had nothing to do with humor. It was the sound of people witnessing something genuine and not knowing quite how to file it. Rhett noticed. He was young, but he wasn't stupid, and he could feel the room, even an outdoor room, even a crowd with no walls shifting its weight. Boone sidled up to him between rounds 8 and 9. "You want to call it," he said quietly. "No," Rhett said. "You're down 24. "I know what I'm down. That old man isn't getting tired. He isn't missing. He ain't even blinking hard." Boone looked at Silas, who was standing in the dirt with his arms loose at his sides, not talking to anyone, not performing. "Rhett, let it go. It's not about the money." Boone was quiet for a moment. "I know that," he said. "That's why I'm telling you to let it go." But Rhett was already turning away, reaching for the next dollar. The 9th coin went up crooked, because Rhett's throw had more anger in it than he meant to show. It was a bad toss low and sideways, the kind that any reasonable judge of a contest would have called a do-over. The crowd saw it. A few men even called out something, objections, advice, something. Silas drew anyway. He fired before the coin had reached its apex, hitting it on the rise, which was harder than hitting it at the peak or on the fall, because the target's motion was more erratic. The coin spun out of its already crooked path and dropped into the dirt with a fresh hole in it. Someone in the crowd said, in a voice that was not trying to be loud, "Lord Almighty." Silas picked up the coin himself this time. He walked it over to Rhett and set it in his palm. "Bad toss," Silas said. "I'll give you that one back if you want." Rhett looked at the coin. "Keep the round," he said. Silas nodded and walked back. It was the worst thing Rhett could have seen. Not the shot, he'd already absorbed the shots, or tried to. It was the offer. The old man was not crowing. He was not grinding the loss in. He was extending a kind of plain decency, the way you'd return a dropped tool to a stranger, and there was nothing in it that suggested condescension. He simply saw a bad toss and offered a fair correction. That was not how you beat a man. That was not how the game was supposed to work. Rhett's jaw tightened. He looked at Boone and Eli, and what he read in their faces was worse than sympathy. It was something close to pity, which he had never in his life accepted from anyone. He reached for the 10th dollar. By round 11, a fact had established itself among the watching crowd that nobody said sets aloud, but everyone understood. They were not watching a shooting contest anymore. They were watching something else, a demonstration, perhaps, or a reckoning. The distinction between those two things was subtle but significant. Silas was not performing. He had never been performing. He drew when the coin went up, he fired when the coin was there to be fired at, and he put the gun away when the coin was on the ground. That was the whole of it. No flourish, no commentary, no reading the crowd for approval. Rhett, by contrast, was unraveling. Not visibly to a casual observer, he might have still looked like a confident young gunslinger, having a run of bad luck. But the men who knew him could see it in small things. The way his right hand had started opening and closing at his side between rounds. The way he was standing slightly forward, weight shifted onto the balls of his feet, which was how he stood when he was angry and trying to control it. The way his eyes had gone flat and still, which meant the part of his brain that processed information had started to lag behind the part that generated feeling. He was $32 in the hole. He had $1 silver left in his vest pocket and the 11th toss coming up. The 11th coin went higher than any of the others, because somewhere in his body a decision had been made that if he was going to lose this, he was going to at least make Silas earn it. He put real strength behind the toss, sending the coin 15 feet into the Wyoming sky, where it turned over and over against the pale afternoon light, catching sun on both faces like a tiny and indifferent mirror. The draw was the same as all the others. The sound was the same. The coin came down with a hole through it. 11 for 11. Rhett stood in the street and looked at the ground for a long moment. The crowd was very quiet. Even the noise from inside the saloon had died down. Someone had propped the doors open so the people inside could hear. He had 1 coin left. He reached into his pocket and took it out. Stood there turning it in his fingers. It was warm from riding in the vest pocket all afternoon. An ordinary thing, $1, a piece of silver minted in a place he'd never seen by men he'd never meet, worth exactly $1 and nothing more. He thought about what Boone had said, let it go. He thought about the crowd, the same crowd that had cheered for him 2 hours ago, watching 14 consecutive contest wins over 2 counties with the kind of uncomplicated enthusiasm that had made him feel like someone worth watching. That crowd was still here, but it was watching Silas now. He looked up. Silas was standing where he always stood, not smiling, not waiting with any visible impatience. He looked like a man who would stand in that spot until the weather changed, and it wouldn't cost him anything. Last one, Rhett said. Last one, Silas agreed. Rhett tossed it. He put everything into the toss, not anger this time, not bravado, but a kind of desperate precision. The coin going up on a true vertical, spinning perfectly. A textbook toss that should have made the shot easier to calculate. Maybe he thought that doing his part flawlessly might some change the outcome. Maybe he thought that if the contest was fair on both ends, something fair might happen. The draw, the shot, the coin, 12 for 12. The crowd exhaled. Not a cheer, not quite. More like a release. Like a room full of people who had been watching someone walk a rope over a canyon, finally seeing that person reach the other side and step off onto solid ground. Relief and something like awe mixed together in the afternoon air. Silas holstered his revolver and looked at Rhett. Rhett was standing with both hands loose at his sides, $12 silver in the dirt between them, and $36 in entry fees spent. His face was its own kind of wreckage, not destroyed, but rearranged. The easy confidence had come apart at the seams, and what was beneath it was younger and rawer and harder to look at. "You're a good shot," Silas said. And he meant it. He'd watched Rhett between rounds, had clocked the speed and the form, had recognized real talent sitting beneath all the performance. "You've got good hands. You'll be better when the winning matters less to you." He said it the way men say things they believe, but don't enjoy saying without pleasure, without cruelty. Just the truth, offered to the open air. Then he walked to the bar of the coins in the dirt, began collecting them, and turned back toward the saloon doors. He wanted to finish his whiskey. He had a long ride tomorrow, and his knee was asking questions he didn't have answers for yet. He was done with the afternoon. He was done with the whole of it. He did not see Rhett's hand drop to his holster. He did not see the flash of decision cross Rhett's face, something fast and terrible and final, the way a man looks in the instant before he does something he cannot take back, the precise second when shame finishes burning and turns into something darker and more permanent. He heard Boone's voice, a single sharp word, half warning and half something else, and that was enough. Silas had spent 30 years on the frontier being taught by men and circumstances that the back is not a safe place, that the moment you turn away from danger is not the moment it ends. That survival had a specific sound, a change in the air, a half-second of wrongness that preceded everything important. He heard it now. His body moved before the decision to move reached him consciously, not thought, not calculation. Just the deep mechanical response of a man who had survived too many bad situations to wait for his brain to catch up. He was already spinning as the hammer on Rhett's gun drew back, already drawing from the holster he hadn't needed to check once the entire afternoon. The old revolver coming up in a single motion that was nothing like a performance and everything like the thing that performances are poor imitations of. The shot was the same sound as all the others. One clean, flat crack. The difference was what fell. Not a coin. Not something that rang when it hit the dirt. Rhett Callahan folded like a man who has been carrying too much weight and finally sets it down. He hit the boards of the saloon doorway first, then the dirt below, and lay still. The gun he'd drawn hadn't cleared leather. The crowd that had stood in the street for $12 silver now stood in absolute silence for something they had not come to see and would not easily forget. Silas stood in the doorway, the revolver in his hand, smoke rising from the barrel the way smoke rises from a fire that has just been put out thin and purposeful and already dissipating. He looked at Rhett on the ground. He looked at Boone and Eli, who had gone the color of chalk, their hands away from their bodies, not touching anything, not moving. He lowered the gun. He looked at it for a moment, this plain, worn, ordinary-looking weapon that had put 12 holes through silver dollars and one into a young man who should have known better. It did not look different than it had at any other point in the afternoon. It was still just a gun. That was the thing about it. It didn't care what it was used for. That was the man's job. He holstered it. He looked at Rhett one more time, checked what needed to be checked, made the determination that experience makes possible. Then he walked back into the Buckhorn Saloon, past the open-mouthed bartender and the frozen card players and the two women at the window who were holding each other's arms, and he sat down on the same stool where his hat had been knocked to the floor not 2 hours ago, and he picked up his whiskey glass, and he finished what was left in it. It wasn't much, it wasn't enough, but it was all he'd asked for. The whiskey didn't taste like anything. That was the first thing Silas noticed, sitting on that same stool with the same glass in the same position it had been in, before the afternoon turned into whatever the afternoon had turned into. He'd been looking forward to this whiskey cheap, he'd told the bartender, and the bartender had obliged, pouring something that probably came from a barrel that had never seen the inside of a proper distillery. He'd wanted the roughness of it, the honest burn of a bad drink after a long ride. Instead, it sat on his tongue like warm water with ambitions. His hands were steady. They were always steady afterward. That was one of the things nobody told you, and that you couldn't predict about yourself. Until the first time it happened, some men fell apart after a shooting, shook for hours, couldn't hold a cup. Others went cold and mechanical, processing the event the way a machine processes material intake, output, no storage. Silas had learned a long time ago that he was the second kind. It wasn't something he was proud of. It wasn't something he was ashamed of either. It was just what he was. He set the glass down. The bartender, a wide-shouldered man in his 40s named Cutter, according to the sign behind the bar that read Cutter's Place in faded paint, was pretending to polish glasses at the far end of the counter. He was the only one in the room pretending anything. Everyone else had stopped the pretense and was simply staring, the way people stare at aftermath, when they haven't yet decided whether they're safe. Silas pulled 2 coins from his pocket and set them on the bar. "For the glass," he said, "and for your trouble." Cutter walked over and looked at the coins. He looked at Silas. "That's more than the glass cost." "Keep the rest," Silas said. "I expect you'll be answering questions for the next few hours, and I'd rather leave you something for the inconvenience." Cutter picked up the coins slowly, the way you pick something up when you're not entirely sure what it means to take it. He put them in his apron. He didn't thank Silas, which Silas respected. He hadn't offered the money to be thanked. The sound from outside had changed. The stunned silence of the immediate aftermath had begun to fill with the kind of noise that follows a shock, voices, movement, the specific energy of a crowd transitioning from witnesses to participants. Someone was giving an account. Someone else was correcting details. 2 or 3 people were talking over one another in the urgent, overlapping way that happens when a story is still being formed, and everyone wants their version to be the one that sticks. Silas could hear most of it through the open doors without trying. He heard Boone's voice, lower than the others, something clipped and controlled. He heard Eli asking about a doctor, which answered a question Silas had asked himself without making a production of it. Not dead then. Not yet, and maybe not at all, depending on where exactly the shot had landed and what the town's medical situation looked like. He had not fired to kill. He had fired to stop. In 30 years of distinguishing between those two things, he had not always been successful, and the fact of that sat in him permanently, the way old injuries sit in the body, not always painful, but present, making themselves known in cold weather and quiet moments. But this afternoon in that doorway, the calculation had been precise and intentional. The shot had gone where he'd sent it. Whether that was enough was still a question the next few hours would answer. Cutter had stopped pretending to polish glasses. He stood directly across from Silas now, forearms on the bar, looking at him with the expression of a man assembling a question from complicated parts. You know who that boy's father is? Cutter asked. Silas looked at him. Should I? Wade Callahan, Cutter said. Runs the double C spread, 20 miles north. Has about 40 men on his payroll, of which maybe a third of them aren't actually working cattle. He paused, letting that settle. He's been trying to buy out every small rancher between here and the northern pass for the past 2 years. The ones who don't sell find other reasons to leave. Silas was quiet. Red is his only son, Cutter said. The one he's built everything toward. Had him entered in every shooting competition in the territory since the boy was 16. The winning streak you just ended was well. It was something Wade Callahan talked about at every opportunity. Another pause, including last week to the county commissioner during a meeting about grazing rights. So the boy's more than just the boy, Silas said. The boy is Wade Callahan's reputation wearing a hat, Cutter said. And you put a hole in him. Silas turned the empty glass in his hands. Not quite 3 hours ago, he had ridden into this town wanting a drink and a quiet afternoon. What he had instead was a wounded man in the street, a powerful rancher with reasons to be angry, and a knee that was going to cost him tomorrow's first mile of tracking. You telling me to leave, he said. I'm telling you facts, Cutter said. What you do with them is your own business. Silas nodded once. He turned on the stool and looked toward the doors. Through them he could see the edge of the crowd, still gathered, still processing. The late afternoon sun had gone orange, cutting long shadows across the dirt. An hour, maybe less, until dark. He thought about the cattle tracking job. He thought about Aldous Pope, who was expecting him by tomorrow morning, and who was probably already anxious about the missing herd and didn't need his tracker failing to appear. He thought about the 3 days of riding behind him and the fact that he had nowhere particular to be other than where the work was. He thought about Wade Callahan with 40 men on his payroll, a third of them not working cattle. He thought about the fact that none of that changed what had happened in the doorway, or why, or what the available alternatives had been. Is there a doctor in Larkspur? He asked. Vet, Cutter said. Crandall, he does what he can. Is he good? Cutter considered. Better than nothing. Worse than nothing if he's been drinking. What time does he usually start? Afternoon. Silas looked at the light outside. Then we might be all right. He stood up. He took his hat from the stool beside him and put it on his head. He straightened his coat, which still had a faint whiskey stain on the left lapel from Rhett's careless bullet 3 hours ago. The shot that had started all of this, the beginning that nobody had called a beginning when it happened. He walked to the door. The crowd outside had reorganized itself. Rhett was on his back in the street, which was better than being face down. And Eli was kneeling beside him with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had aged 4 years in one afternoon. Boone was standing a short distance back with his arms crossed, watching Silas emerge from the saloon, with an expression that was trying to be dangerous, and landing somewhere closer to uncertain. Silas looked at Rhett. The wound was in the right shoulder high and outside, which was what he'd intended. Enough to stop a draw, not enough to end a life, provided it was dealt with properly. The bleeding was bad, but not catastrophic. The kid was conscious, which was a reasonable sign. He walked over and crouched down next to Eli. Rhett looked up at him. His face was pale from blood loss and pain, and the expression on it was hard to read anger and shock and something raw underneath both of those. Something younger than either. He did not say anything. Who's got a clean cloth? Silas said, not to Rhett, just to the open air. Someone handed something over a folded square of cotton from someone's pocket. Not clean exactly, but cleaner than the alternatives. Silas pressed it to the shoulder wound with enough pressure to count. Rhett made a sound through his teeth. Hold still, Silas said. Rhett started and stopped. His jaw worked. Don't tell me to hold still, all right, Silas said. He maintained the pressure, then shift around if you need to. Won't help, but it's your shoulder. Eli was watching him with an expression he hadn't sorted out yet. Why are you helping? He asked. The question wasn't hostile, it was genuine. A young man actually trying to understand the world. Because I shot him, Silas said. Doesn't mean I want him to bleed out in the street. You could have just walked away. I could have just not entered the contest, Silas said. There were a lot of choices available earlier in the afternoon. We made the ones we made. This is what's left. Boone had moved closer, watching. He said nothing, but something in his posture had shifted. The aggressive performance had come down, leaving something more ordinary and a good deal less comfortable behind it. Rhett looked up at Silas again. His color was bad and his breathing was shallow in the way that pain makes breathing shallow, and his right hand was gripping his own coat so hard his knuckles had gone white. You're the one who should be on the ground, he said. It came out quieter than he probably intended, and without the heat that should have backed it. You're probably right, Silas said. Rhett blinked. Whatever he'd expected in response, it hadn't been that. I've made enough bad choices in my life that I should have caught a bullet a dozen times over, Silas said. Didn't, for reasons I can't fully account for. Luck mostly. Bad aim on the other end. being in the right spot of a wrong situation. He kept his hand on the cloth, kept the pressure steady. You made a bad choice today. Doesn't mean the next 40 years have to be decided by this afternoon. Rhett turned his face away. His jaw was tight, and Silas could see him working something through some calculation, or feeling that didn't want to come out as anything sayable. The vet arrived 10 minutes later. His name was Crandall, and he was not drunk, which Cutter had assessed correctly as the best available outcome. He was a compact, precise man in his 50s who looked at the wound with the detached professionalism of someone who had extracted bullets from living creatures of various sizes and had learned not to editorialize. You the one who did this? He asked Silas, crouching down. Yes, Silas said. Crandall looked at the wound placement. He looked at Silas. He said nothing about it, nothing good, nothing bad. He just nodded once and got to work, and Silas stood up and stepped back to give him room. He stood at the edge of the crowd, which had thinned but not dispersed. A few men had gone back inside, more had stayed, because the event was not over, and people knew it without being told. The light had gone from orange to something deeper, and the street lanterns would need to be lit soon. A man appeared at Silas's left elbow. He was maybe 60 broad in the way of men who had worked outdoors for all of their adult lives, with white hair cut close to his head, and a face that had been used by weather. He wore decent clothes, not rich, but not rough either. He had the particular bearing of a man who had responsibilities and had carried them long enough that they'd altered his posture. Name's Roy Garrett, he said. I run the feed store on the north end. I also keep the town's unofficial accounts of things, which is a polite way of saying I remember what happens here and sometimes I tell people. He looked at Rhett in the street, at Crandall's hands working. That was a fair shooting. That's not what his father will say, Silas said. No, Roy agreed, it isn't. They stood together quietly for a moment. There were 30-some people watching that contest, Roy said, and another dozen who heard most of it from inside. Everyone here will tell the same story, because the story isn't complicated. The boy drew first, you responded. That's lawful frontier self-defense in any jurisdiction from here to the Missouri. Laws in Wade Callahan aren't necessarily the same thing, Silas said. No, Roy said again. But they're closer than they used to be. We got a circuit judge comes through every 6 weeks. He's honest, which around here is somewhat unusual. He paused. I'm not saying Wade won't come down here with bad intentions. I'm saying he'll have a harder time acting on them than he might expect. Silas looked at the man. Why are you telling me this? Roy was quiet for a moment then. Because I know who you are. Silas kept his expression even. Is that Silas Crowe? Roy said. You tracked a missing herd for the Pendleton family about 6 years ago. Before that, you worked for the federal marshal's office out of Cheyenne for about 3 years. Before that paused. Well, before that is a longer story, and I only know pieces of it. Silas said nothing. I've been trying to get Wade Callahan to stop buying out my neighbors for 2 years, Roy said. I've written 3 letters to the county commission. I've talked to the circuit judge. I've talked to every rancher within a day's ride who hasn't already signed over their deed. He looked at Rhett again. Nothing has moved it. I'm a cattle tracker, Silas said. I have a job waiting on the other side of this town. I know, Roy said. For Aldous Pope, who is one of 3 men left in this valley who hasn't sold to Callahan, because Aldous Pope is too stubborn to be bought and too canny to be easily frightened. Silas turned and looked at Roy Garrett directly for the first time in the conversation. The older man met his gaze without flinching or elaborating. He was not making a pitch. Exactly, he was laying out facts and letting Silas do the calculation, which Silas respected because it was what he would have done. What happened to the cattle? Silas asked. Pope's cattle? Roy's mouth tightened. They didn't drift. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Who drove them off? No one's proven anything, Roy said. But 62 head don't wander through a river crossing without help. And in the 2 months before it happened, 2 other ranchers in this valley had equipment go missing. Then a barn fire, then they sold. He kept his voice low, easy, the tone of a man relaying information at a feed counter. The pattern isn't subtle. It's just that no one's been in a position to do anything about it. The sun was down behind the hills now, leaving the sky a bruised and fading blue. The lanterns were starting to come on along the street. Crandall had finished with Rhett's shoulder and was giving instructions to Eli, who was nodding and trying to absorb information under conditions that weren't ideal for absorption. I'll track Pope's cattle, Silas said. That's what I agreed to do. Roy said, whatever I find is whatever I find. I know that too. And I'm not a solution to Wade Callahan. I'm a man who tracks cattle and occasionally shoots people who try to shoot him in the back. Roy almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more like the lines of his face rearranging themselves in the direction of one. That's fair, he said. He tipped his head slightly and walked back toward the feed store, unhurried, as if they'd been discussing grain prices. Boone Mercer found Silas an hour later at the livery stable, where Silas was checking his horse's left rear shoe which had been loose since the second day of riding and was now threatening to become a real problem. The livery was warm and smelled of hay and old wooden horses, which Silas had always found more comfortable than most rooms with walls. His horse, a dark roan, gelding with a scar above his left eye from an incident 5 years back, involving a fence wire, was tolerating the examination with the resigned dignity of an animal that has learned its opinions are noted but not acted upon. Boone stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in. He was 21. Silas had estimated from a few things said earlier younger than Rhett by 2 years, which put the afternoon in a different light. Boys, basically. Well-armed, talented, operating on the confidence that comes from winning enough times that you start to confuse success with understanding. He's going to be okay, Boone said. Crandall said so. Goods, Silas said. Boone walked further in. He didn't have his swagger from earlier. It had left him somewhere around round 8 of the contest and hadn't returned. What replaced it was something less comfortable and more honest. He looked like a young man trying to find a way to say something that didn't have obvious language. We didn't know, Boone said finally. Silas looked at him. What didn't you know? What you were? Boone's hands went into his jacket pockets. Who you were? We thought. He stopped. We were just looking to take money off some old drifter. That's what we thought you were. That's fair, Silas said. I look like an old drifter. We've done it before, Boone said. Found some old cowboy who looks like he might be carrying a few dollars and got him into a contest. He stopped again. He was struggling, not because he couldn't find the words, but because the words once said were going to make him see the afternoon in a way that was worse than he wanted to see it. We made money doing it. Rhett would win the contest and we'd laugh about it after. And the old cowboys, Silas said, how'd they take losing? Boone's jaw moved. Some of them were mad, some just left. He looked at the floor. One started crying. He shook his head. We laughed about that one too. Silas said nothing. I'm not saying that to get something, Boone said quickly. I'm not asking for anything. He seemed genuinely lost. 21 years old, standing in a livery stable, trying to make the afternoon make sense. Why didn't you just take the money and go? After the first few rounds, when it was clear you were going to win, why didn't you just leave? Silas said. Yeah. Silas straightened up from the horse's leg. He leaned against the stall post and looked at Boone directly. Your friend humiliated himself in front of his whole town, he said. I didn't do that to him. He did that to himself. By picking a fight he didn't know the dimensions of. If I'd walked away after 3 rounds, he'd have told everyone he ran me off and rebuilt his confidence on a lie. That doesn't help him. It would have been better for you, Boone said. Probably, Silas said. But I played the contest. I finished the contest. That's the only thing I did wrong today, and it was legal. Boone was quiet. Your friend drew on a man who had his back turned, Silas said. That's not a shooting contest. That's not losing with bad grace. That's a decision to kill someone because you couldn't accept a fair outcome. He kept his voice even. Not lecturing, explaining, the way you explain a mechanical thing to someone who genuinely doesn't understand how it works. I've known men who've made that decision for less reason. Most of them didn't survive the attempt. Rhett's lucky that the round he drew against had no interest in killing him. Boone turned that over for a while. Then you could have let him draw. Let it go further. You had time. I had exactly as much time as I used, Silas said. Not more. That landed. Boone absorbed it, and something in his face changed, some calculation completing itself, some number he'd been running finally reaching its result. He looked younger than 21 then, or maybe just more accurately 21, without the performance that the afternoon had stripped away. He's going to say you cheated, Boone said when he's feeling better. He's going to say the contest was rigged somehow. Most men say something like that, Silas said. People won't believe it. They were all watching. They don't have to believe it, Silas said. He just needs to say it, so he has something to say. It's not about convincing anyone. It's about having a version of today that he can carry forward. He paused. Let him have it. Boone looked at him like he wasn't sure if he was hearing wisdom or the most frustrating thing he'd ever encountered. Probably both, Silas thought. That was often how wisdom landed. What about his father? Boone said. What about him? Wade Callahan is going to... He stopped himself. Chose different words. He's not going to let this rest. You know that. I know that, Silas said. And you're staying. I have a job to do, Silas said. Boone looked at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly, with the specific quality of disbelief that young men have when an older person does something that makes sense but defies every obvious self-interest. You're going to track Pope's cattle. That's the job. Even knowing, especially knowing, Silas said. Boone was quiet for a long time. He looked at the horse, then at his boots, then at some middle point that had no specific object. Then he said, in a voice that was quieter than anything else he'd said, when Rhett drew, I was going to stop him. I almost said something. And then I didn't. He kept looking at the middle point. I don't know why I didn't. Silas let that sit for a moment. Then you told him not to push it earlier, between rounds. Boone looked up quickly. You heard that? I hear most things. I told him to let it go, Boone said. He wouldn't. I know, Silas said. I watched you say it. Boone seemed surprised that Silas had been tracking the periphery of that contest as carefully as the coins, watching not just where the threat was visible, but where it might emerge. That was another thing you couldn't learn in a shooting contest. The difference between saying a thing and stopping a thing is about 1.5 seconds, Silas said. When you see it coming next time, don't spend the 1.5 seconds trying to find words. Move, Boone absorbed that. Go look after your friend, Silas said. He's going to need people around him tonight who aren't interested in what it means for them. Boone straightened up. He started to say something Silas could see it forming, and then seemed to decide against it, which was the right call. He turned and walked out of the livery, and his footsteps on the packed dirt outside were different from when he'd come in, not heavier exactly, but less casual, more deliberate, as if the ground had changed its texture in the past hour, and he was adjusting his step accordingly. Silas slept at the livery, which he'd arranged with the stable hand for a few coins, and a promise to be gone by first light. He spread his bedroll in the back stall next to the roan, and lay on his back with his coat over his chest and his revolver within reach of his right hand, which was habit and not paranoia, or possibly both, he'd never fully decided. He lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling beams. He thought about Roy Garrett's words, "They didn't drift." The matter-of-fact delivery of it, the lack of drama. The way a man relays information that has ceased to shock him because he's been living next to it long enough. He thought about 62 cattle, which was not a casual number. 62 head, walked off through a river crossing by people who knew what they were doing and had the patience to wait for the right conditions. Not rustlers working opportunistically, something more organized, more intentional. The kind of operation that needed someone above it making decisions and someone below it doing the work, and enough people in between to keep the connection invisible. He thought about a barn fire, equipment gone missing, ranchers signing deeds. He thought about Rhett Callahan lying in the street with a shoulder wound, and Wade Callahan 20 miles north, probably already receiving a rider. The information would travel tonight. It would arrive in some form, exaggerated, trimmed, shaped by whoever carried it, and whatever that person wanted Wade Callahan to feel. The true parts would be in there somewhere, embedded in the version. A man had beaten his son at a shooting contest. His son had drawn on a man who had his back turned and had ended up in the dirt. 30 people had witnessed it. Wade Callahan would process that information in whatever way Wade Callahan processed information. Silas had known enough men like him to have a reasonable projection. The anger would be real, the response would be calculated, and the calculation would factor in the 30 witnesses, which was a complication that pure rage didn't accommodate. The question was what form the response took and how fast it moved. He set that question aside. He'd answer it when it had enough shape to engage with. Right now it was just geometry angles and distances and unknowns, the kind of problem that didn't reward being hurried. His knee had settled into its nightly complaint, a dull, persistent ache that sat above the joint and radiated down. He'd had it for 9 years, since a fall on loose shale that had done something inside the structure that never quite healed back right. On good days it was background noise. On bad days it was the whole conversation. Tomorrow would probably be a bad day, given the cold that had started moving in after sundown. He thought about the tracking job. 62 cattle missing after a river crossing. River crossings left signs on both banks, on the bed itself if it was shallow enough, in the vegetation on the far side. Someone had moved those animals with intention, which meant there was a destination. Intentional movement toward a destination left more trace than drift. Animals moving under drive had different spacing, different gait signatures in the ground. He could read that, given enough light and enough time, and a knee that cooperated at least partially. He'd ridden harder cases in worse condition. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep quickly. He never did after a shooting. That was the other thing nobody told you about, not the shaking, or the stillness, but the long, wakeful accounting that came later, the part where the body finally got quiet enough for the mind to process what it had done and why, and whether it had made the correct calculation with the information available. He ran it again, the way he always ran it, the moment of the wrongness in the air, the decision to move, the shot. He measured the alternative, not moving, waiting, trusting against what Rhett's face had looked like in the moment before he drew. The calculation came out the same way it had the first time. He went to sleep. Outside, Larkspur settled into its night sounds, a door closing somewhere, a horse shifting, the distant and intermittent noise from the buckhorn, where the card game that had survived the afternoon was apparently going to survive the evening as well. Somewhere to the north, on a road that ran through dark and empty miles, a rider was carrying news toward a ranch house, where a powerful man was about to learn that the afternoon had not gone the way any of them had planned. The roan gelding in the next stall exhaled slowly and shifted his weight. Silas Crowe slept with his hand near the revolver, and his face turned toward the ceiling, and if he dreamed whatever the dreams contained, they did not wake him. He was on the road before the sun cleared the hills. The roan's bad shoe had been fixed by the stable hand, a boy of maybe 15 who'd been awake when Silas rose and who'd taken the job without being asked, working by lantern light with the focused competence of someone who'd learned the trade young and learned it properly. Silas had paid him double what the work was worth, which surprised the boy into silence, and then rode out of Larkspur while the town was still doing the particular kind of sleeping that comes before dawn, when even the restless ones have finally gone under. The road north was unpaved and rutted from the last rain, and the cold that had moved in overnight had stiffened the ground enough to make the ruts sharp-edged and unforgiving. The roan picked his way through them with the grudging care of an experienced animal who had opinions about footing. Silas let him choose his own line. The knee was bad this morning, worse than he'd projected, which meant the cold had moved further in than he'd accounted for. He sat straight in the saddle because slouching made it worse, not better, a counterintuitive fact he'd taken 3 years to accept. He had the road to himself for the first hour. Nothing moved in the gray pre-dawn except a hawk working the ridgeline to the east, banking on thermals that Silas couldn't feel from ground level, but that the bird read like text. He watched it for a while. There was something clarifying about a hawk at work, the pure economy of it. Nothing wasted, every adjustment purposeful. He had always found it easier to think when something like that was in his field of vision. His mind ran cleaner alongside something that knew what it was doing. He thought about the night. He had slept, eventually. Not long and not deep, but enough to run the calculations that needed running. Roy Garrett's information had done its work in the dark hours. The pattern of the valley, the missing cattle, the barn fire, the deeds signed under the particular pressure that didn't leave marks. The shape of it was not complicated. It was old as land and money and men who wanted both, and it ran on the same logic it always ran on. Find the leverage. Apply it. Move to the next one. The complication, from Wade Callahan's perspective, was that the pattern had been working. The complications, plural, were that now it had a witness, a man who had arrived in Larkspur for an unrelated reason, had been present for an afternoon that the entire town had watched, had a reputation that Roy Garrett knew and Wade Callahan probably did too, and was now riding toward the one rancher in the valley who hadn't yet sold or run. Silas was aware that he had become a complication without particularly trying to. That awareness didn't change what he was going to do. The cattle tracking job was the cattle tracking job. But it changed what he needed to pay attention to, which was already a long list and had just grown by several items. He reached Pope's ranch by mid-morning. Aldous Pope was 63 years old and built like a man who had started life with good material and then used it very hard for a very long time. He was not tall, but he was dense wide through the shoulders in a way that suggested he had spent decades doing physical labor that most men his age had long since delegated. His hands were the hands of someone who still worked, not just supervised working. He had a gray beard cut close to his jaw and eyes the color of good gunmetal that watched Silas ride in with the calibrated attention of a man who has learned to read visitors correctly, because the cost of reading them wrong is too high. He was standing in the yard when Silas arrived, next to a hand pump that had a piece of equipment attached to it that Silas couldn't immediately identify the purpose of. Pope had a wrench in one hand and grease on the other, and looked like the sort of man who would keep working right up until the conversation required him to stop, and possibly after. "Crowe," he said. "Pope," Silas said. Pope looked at him for a moment with the wrench still in his hand. "Heard you had an eventful afternoon in town, news travels. My hand rode in late last night for supplies. Said the whole Buckhorn was talking about it." Pope set the wrench on the pump housing. Said, "You put a hole through $12 and then put one through Rhett Callahan." "That's accurate," Silas said. Pope looked at him another moment, then turned and walked toward the house. "Come in and eat something," he said over his shoulder. "You can tell me the rest while I clean this grease off my hands." The inside of Pope's ranch house was the inside of a man who had built something and lived in it and not bothered much with decoration. The furniture was heavy and functional. The walls had a few things on them: a calendar, a hand-drawn map of the valley with property lines marked in pencil, a rifle on pegs above the door that looked maintained and ready. The kitchen table had the worn surface of a table that had been used for every meal and most of the serious conversations that had happened in this building for probably 30 years. A woman came in from the back middle 60s, solid, with the particular economy of movement that belongs to women who have managed a working household for most of their adult lives. She put a plate in front of Silas without asking what he wanted, and refilled Pope's coffee cup without being told, And then she stayed in the kitchen doing other things, which meant she was also listening, which was the prerogative of the person making the food. Tell me about the cattle, Silas said. Pope wrapped his hands around his cup. River crossing 3 miles east where Garrison Creek bends south. The herd was moving well. We'd done that crossing a dozen times. Then the rain hit fast, faster than we expected, and the creek came up. We got most of them across. When the water went down and we did the count, 62 head were gone. He paused. My foreman said the bank signs on the far side weren't right for drift. Meaning the prints were too organized. Animals drifting scatter. These tracks came off the bank in a pattern that looked more like a drive. Pope looked at his coffee. I've been ranching for 38 years. I know what drift looks like. Who knows this crossing well enough to use the creek surge as cover? Silas asked. Pope was quiet for a moment. Any man who's worked this valley long enough, which includes about 40 of Wade Callahan's hands. Your foreman still here, Ned? Yeah, he can take you to the crossing. Silas ate. The food was eggs and salt pork and biscuits that were better than they had any reason to be given the apparent circumstances of their preparation. He ate without complimenting them, which he suspected was the correct response in this household. Roy Garrett talked to me last night, Silas said. Pope's expression shifted slightly, not surprise, but something. What'd he say? He gave me the sequence, the barn fire, the equipment, the sales, the pattern. Silas looked at Pope directly. He said you were one of 3 holdouts. 2 now, Pope said. Heller signed 2 weeks ago. Said his wife's health. Said he needed the money. Both are true. He set down his cup. Cora Whitfield is the other. She's got 240 acres on the south pasture, been there since her husband died 7 years ago. Runs it with one hand and her 17-year-old nephew. He paused. Callahan's been offering her a number that's insultingly low because he figures a widow woman alone doesn't have options. She's been telling him where to put the number. Good for her, Silas said. It is, Pope said. It's also going to get complicated for her. Silas's foreman, Ned, was a lean and weathered man of about 45 who had the look of someone permanently ready to be surprised by bad news and permanently resigned to dealing with it. He met Silas in the yard after the meal and led him east toward Garrison Creek without much conversation, which Silas appreciated. The morning had warmed enough to soften the ground, which was what he needed. The crossing was exactly what Pope had described. A bend in Garrison Creek where the banks were low and the bed was wide and flat, a natural ford that generations of cattle had used. You could see the evidence of regular use in the worn approaches on both sides, the paths beaten down to bare earth by hooves over years. Silas dismounted at the near bank and stood for a long moment doing nothing but looking. Ned stood back and watched him look, which was the right thing to do. Some trackers needed to talk through what they were seeing. Silas was not that kind. He walked the near bank first, east to west, moving slowly, crouching twice to get closer to specific areas. The rain had disturbed the older sign, but not completely below the disturbed layer there were older prints, and the rain itself had created a kind of record in how the water had flowed around and between things. He read the bank the way you read a letter that's been soaked and dried, with patience reconstructing from what remained. Then he crossed, testing the creek depth at 3 points. It was knee-deep in the center now and would have been higher during the surge. Maybe chest-deep, maybe more. High enough to take cattle off their feet if they were caught in the wrong spot. High enough to obscure a lot of what was happening on the surface. The far bank told a better story. He spent 40 minutes on the far bank, saying nothing, moving in a pattern that looked random but wasn't. He worked outward from the main crossing point in arcs, reading the ground each 10 feet further from the water's edge. What he found was not subtle, once you knew what to look for. The individual prints of 62 cattle scattered by drift would have a specific signature-wide spacing, irregular direction, the erratic geometry of animals moving without guidance. What he was reading was different. The spacing compressed, the directions organized. The geometry had purpose. These animals had been driven, not harshly, not at speed. Someone who knew cattle had kept them calm and moving, which required skill and patience and at least 4 riders on the outside of the herd to prevent scatter. You could see where the outside riders had been from the horse prints in the softer ground above the bank wide, positioned to flank, turning back twice in spots where a few animals had tried to break. 4 riders minimum, possibly 5. He found the direction of travel in the compressed tracks, northeast toward higher ground, toward the broken country above the valley floor, where the terrain would absorb a moving herd, and where an outsider without local knowledge would have considerable difficulty following. He stood up and looked northeast. They went up, he said. Ned, who had been standing 20 feet behind him throughout, came forward. He looked at the ground. He looked where Silas was looking. That's Callahan's high range, he said. I know, Silas said. That's where we're going. Ned was quiet for a moment. That's Callahan's land. His cattle aren't marked yet, Silas said. Pope's brand is still on them. Legally speaking, whoever's holding them is holding stolen property. He paused. But that's for later. First, I need to find them. Ned had the expression of a man who was calculating whether his loyalty to his employer extended to riding onto the property of someone who had a demonstrated pattern of making problems disappear. The calculation took a few seconds. I'll come, he said. No, Silas said. You go back and tell Pope what we found. Tell him the direction. Tell him to write it down and tell Roy Garrett the same. He looked at Ned. If I'm not back in 2 days, that information needs to exist somewhere that isn't just inside my head. Ned didn't look relieved exactly, but something in him settled. What are you going to do, track cattle? Silas said. That's the job. The high range was rough country draws and outcroppings and stands of timber that had never been cleared because clearing them wasn't worth the effort. It was the kind of land that belonged to itself more than to whoever held the deed, and it ran its own rules about what could be hidden in it and for how long. Silas followed the track through mid-afternoon, moving carefully, reading the ground at a pace that his knee objected to, but that accuracy required. The trail was 3 days old the time since the cattle had gone missing, and 3 days of weather and wind had worked at it steadily. But whoever had driven the herd had not been thinking about whether someone would follow. They'd been thinking about moving fast and getting clear, which meant they'd left more sign than a careful man would have. He found where they'd camped the first night, 7 miles up, a flat clearing with the remains of a fire that someone had tried to scatter but hadn't entirely scattered, and the clear impression in the grass of 62 cattle bedded for the night. The grass had re-straightened somewhat in 3 days, but not entirely. He could read the size and density of the bedding from what remained. 5 riders, he'd revised the count upward from the bank sign. 5 men, 1 fire, 1 night in the high country with a stolen herd. The trail continued northeast. He followed it for another 3 miles, and then he stopped. Below a limestone outcropping in a wide draw that was invisible from the valley below, he found the cattle. They were penned in a makeshift enclosure, deadfall logs and rope, the kind of temporary structure you build when you need something to hold for a week, but not a month. The animals were calm, they'd had enough time to settle, and there was water nearby from a seep on the east face of the draw. Pope's brand was visible on the near animal's hips, clear and unmodified. Nobody was watching them. That was the first thing Silas registered. No guard on the pen, no rider making rounds. Either they hadn't expected anyone to follow this quickly, or they'd pulled the riders off for some other purpose, or they were confident enough in the terrain's concealment that they hadn't bothered. None of those options was entirely comfortable. He sat on the roan at the edge of the tree line and looked at the pen for several minutes without moving. He looked at the approaches, the sight lines, the terrain above and below. He looked for disturbance in the surrounding ground, fresh horse prints, the signs of recent passage. What he found on the south face of the draw was a single set of prints that were less than 2 hours old. One horse coming down from higher ground, stopping briefly at the tree line near where he was standing now, then turning back up. Someone had been here very recently to check on the herd. That someone had left, which meant they would be back. Silas backed the roan further into the timber and tied him off on a branch where the horse would be quiet and still. Then he found a position 20 yards above the pen, behind a limestone shelf, where he could see the entire draw and both approaches without being visible from either. He settled in to wait. The man came back an hour before dark. He came down from the north, riding easy, not in a hurry. Mid-30s, broad-built, with a double C brand on his saddle skirt that was visible when the evening light caught it at the right angle. He rode like a man doing a routine task, checking inventory. Nothing more interesting than that. He did a slow circuit of the pen, counting the animals with the perfunctory attention of someone who already knew the number. He checked the rope on the east side where it had gone a little slack. He looked at the seep and confirmed the water was running. He did not look up at the limestone shelf. He turned his horse back toward the north approach, and that was when Silas spoke. "How many more you got coming?" The man's horse startled, a sharp sideways jump that the rider absorbed with the reflex of an experienced horseman, getting the animal under control in 2 seconds. He looked up toward the shelf, couldn't find Silas immediately, then found him. Silas was standing on the shelf with the revolver in his hand, pointed in a direction that made the geometry clear. The man's right hand was near his hip, which was instinct. He looked at the geometry. He left his hand where it was. "Who are you?" the man said. "Cattle tracker," Silas said. "Working for Aldous Pope. Those are his animals, with his brand on them in your employer's enclosure." He paused. "I'd like to know whether you're planning to answer my question, or whether you're planning to do something that makes this afternoon worse for both of us." The man's jaw worked. He was thinking Silas could see the calculation running, the assessment of options, the arithmetic of the situation. He was not stupid. He could see the revolver, and he could see the angle, and he could see that there was nothing behind him that improved his odds. "I don't know what you're talking about," the man said. That's fine, Silas said. Then you won't mind waiting here while I go get the county circuit judge and Roy Garrett and a few of the 30 people who watched me put holes through silver dollars yesterday and who are going to be very interested in where those holes lead. He kept his voice conversational. Or you can talk to me now, which is faster and probably better for you in the long run. Silence in the draw, except for the sound of the cattle shifting and the distant seep running over stone. I just work for Callahan, the man said finally. I know, Silas said. That's why I said your employer. Who told you to move these cattle? More silence, longer this time. Foreman named Breckett, the man said. Garrett Breckett. He gave the order after the river surge. Said it was just temporary, hold them up here until things settled. He paused. He said the rancher had agreed to sell anyway. Said it was just moving the timeline. Pope agreed to sell, Silas said. The man had the grace to look uncomfortable. That's what Breckett said. Pope has not agreed to sell, Silas said. Pope has a missing herd and he hired me to find it, which I did. He looked at the man steadily. I need you to do 2 things. First, ride to town and tell Roy Garrett where this pen is. Don't go to the Double C first. Don't send word ahead. Garrett, directly. He paused. Second, think very carefully about whether Garrett Breckett and Wade Callahan are the people you want to be standing next to when the circuit judge comes through. The man looked at the pen. He looked at Silas. He looked at the pen again. And if I don't, he said, then I stay here with Pope's cattle until someone comes who has a better argument than you do, Silas said. And I am patient. The man thought about it for another long moment. Then something in him settled, not peace, not relief. Something more like the feeling of a door closing on a room you'd rather not have been in. Garrett, he said. Garrett, Silas confirmed. The man turned his horse and rode back up the north approach, and this time he did not make it look routine. Silas came down off the shelf and spent the next hour building a proper camp at the draw's edge, not comfortable but functional. He had his bedroll and enough jerky and hardtack in his saddlebag for 2 days. The weather had held clear and would probably hold through tonight. The cattle were calm. The pen was sound enough to hold until morning, and the seep was providing enough water. He built a small fire, not for warmth particularly, but for the practical reason that a fire was visible from a distance, and he wanted any approaching rider to know someone was here before they arrived, not after. He sat beside it and ate jerky and thought about the shape of what he'd found. The operation was competent but not sophisticated. Moving the cattle in the window of the river surge was smart, using natural chaos as cover was something experienced men did. But leaving them unguarded in an enclosure on high range, checking once a day with a single rider, relying on the terrain to keep it hidden, that was the plan of a man who was confident, or possibly who was accustomed to operating, without the kind of opposition that tracked things carefully. Garrett Breckett was the name, the foreman, the man who gave the order. In Silas's experience, foremen who gave orders to steal cattle were not making independent decisions. They were executing someone else's plan with someone else's backing. That was the nature of foremen who kept their jobs in operations like this one. They delivered results within parameters set above them, and the parameters in this valley had been working for 2 years without meaningful resistance. The resistance had started yesterday afternoon in Larkspur, over a bar bet about silver dollars, which was not the kind of origin story that made for clean history. He added a piece of wood to the fire and watched the sparks rise. He thought about Cora Whitfield, 240 acres, one hand, a 17-year-old nephew, an insulting offer from Callahan that she'd refused. The fact that Pope had volunteered that information without being asked suggested it was not peripheral. It was connected. 2 holdouts meant 2 problems for Callahan's pattern. The pattern needed both of them to break. Pope's cattle were the mechanism for breaking Pope manufactured crisis, financial pressure, maybe an offer that looked better in desperation than it had in stability. Whitfield was still standing, which meant her mechanism was either coming or had already been delivered in a form Silas hadn't heard about yet. He looked at the fire. He had tracked Pope's cattle and found them. That was the job he'd agreed to do, and he'd done it. He could send word in the morning, wait for Pope and Roy Garrett to come with witness and documentation, make a proper accounting of what was in this draw, and let the circuit judge do what circuit judges were supposed to do. That was the clean version. He sat with it for a while. Clean versions were worth something. They held up in law. They made records that couldn't be easily denied. They put the evidence in the right hands through the right process. He believed in clean versions. He had spent enough of his life operating outside them to understand their value precisely. But clean versions had timelines. The circuit judge came through every 6 weeks. Roy Garrett would need time to compile the evidence, to find the witnesses who'd talk, to build the case in the way that cases were built. 6 weeks was a long time in a valley where barns burned and equipment went missing, and widows received visits that weren't recorded. He fed more wood to the fire. He looked up at the stars, which were out in force now that the temperature had dropped and the sky had gone fully dark. Wyoming's sky at night was one of those things that defied description if you'd only read about it, the density of it, the sheer quantity of visible light once you were far enough from any settlement to escape its interference. He had spent a considerable portion of his life sleeping under it, and he was no longer moved by it in the easy, immediate way he'd been at 20. But he still looked. You would have to be a particular kind of dead not to. He thought about Boone Mercer's voice in the livery. He's going to come down here with bad intentions. You know that. He thought about Roy Garrett's assessment. He'll have a harder time acting on them than he might expect. But 30 witnesses only held for so long, and a man with 40 armed employees and 2 years of successful pattern operation had options that most men didn't. He thought about Rhett Callahan, lying on the saloon floor with a hole in his shoulder that his father would look at and turn into something else, something with its own momentum, its own requirement for response. The fire burned down, he let it go. He lay back on his bedroll and looked at the stars and listened to the cattle, breathing in the dark, 62 animals in a pen that didn't belong to the men who'd built it, waiting for a resolution that hadn't been decided yet. His knee had settled to a steady throb that he'd learned to read like a weather instrument. Tonight it was saying cold coming, maybe rain by morning. A day of tracking and climbing limestone shelves hadn't improved it, and tomorrow would require more of the same. He closed his hand around nothing in particular, released it, and breathed. Somewhere to the north, 20 miles and a long dark road away, Wade Callahan was sitting with the information that his son was in a vet's back room with a bullet wound, that a stranger had ridden into Larkspur and dismantled everything Rhett had built in front of 30 witnesses, and that the same stranger was now somewhere in the valley, tracking cattle that were supposed to stay lost. What Callahan did with that information in the next 12 hours was the question that mattered. Silas didn't know the answer. He wouldn't know it until it arrived, and it would arrive in a form that didn't ask him whether he was ready. He had been in that position before. He would be in it again. He slept beside the cooling fire, with his revolver in its holster and his hand resting on the grip, and the 62 cattle breathed in their pen below him. And the Wyoming night did what Wyoming nights did in late season. It got cold and clear and very, very quiet. The rain came before dawn, as his knee had predicted. Not heavy, a steady, cold drizzle that moved in from the northwest and settled over the high range like something that intended to stay. Silas had been awake for 20 minutes before it arrived, lying on his bedroll, listening to the quality of the dark change, the way it does when weather is moving in and the air starts carrying a different weight. He'd broken camp and had the roan saddled and was standing under the tree line when the first drops hit the limestone shelf above him. The cattle were restless from the cold and the change in pressure. He could hear them shifting in the pen below, the low sounds they made when they were uncomfortable, but not panicked, a good distinction, one that meant the pen was still holding, and no predator had come down in the night to disturb them. He did a circuit of the enclosure in the gray pre-dawn, checking the rope at 3 points, and found it intact. The seep was still running. He ate the last of his jerky standing in the rain and thought about timing. The man he'd sent to Roy Garrett last night would have reached town sometime around midnight, depending on how hard he'd pushed his horse on the dark road. If he'd gone directly as instructed, Garrett would have had the information for several hours by now. If he'd gone to the Double C first, which was possible, was always possible, when a man's loyalty and his fear were pulling in different directions, then the calculation changed entirely. There was no point in turning the question over. He'd find out when he found out. He was watering the roan at the seep when he heard the first horse coming down from the north approach. He moved the roan back into the tree line with a quiet word and stood watching. His hand was near the revolver, but not on it. One horse, moving at a walk, no particular urgency in the sound of its someone coming to check the herd, the same routine as yesterday, which meant it was probably the same man returning on schedule. It was not the same man. The rider who came into the draw was wider across the shoulders and rode with the forward lean of someone carrying more weight than the man from yesterday. He was maybe 50, maybe less if the years had been hard ones, wearing a coat that had seen better weather and a hat pulled low against the drizzle. He did a slow turn of the pen, checking it, and then he sat his horse in the center of the draw and looked at the tree line directly. "I know you're there," he said. His voice was flat and carried without being raised. A man accustomed to being heard. "I can see the roan's breath." Silas stepped out of the tree line. The man looked at him. He had a broad face with deep-set eyes that had the quality of eyes that have done a lot of watching over a lot of years, and he wore a foreman's badge on his coat that had not been polished recently. This was Garrett Breckett. Silas didn't need to be told. The fit was too precise. "You're the tracker," Breckett said. "That's right," Silas said. Breckett looked at the pen. He looked at Silas. His right hand was on his thigh, not near his weapon, which was either confidence or calculation, probably both. My man told me you found the herd. Your man was supposed to go to Garrett in town, Silas said. He told me first, Beckett said. No apology, no explanation. Just the fact, delivered flat. I'm faster from the ranch than from town. So he went to the Double C, Silas said. He works for the Double C, Beckett said. Men go where their paycheck comes from. It was a reasonable thing to say, which was annoying. Silas looked at the foreman and took his measure. Beckett was not Rhett Callahan. He had none of the young man's performance, none of the hunger for an audience. He was a working man, a professional, someone who did specific things for specific pay, and did not particularly enjoy complications in the doing of them. What did Callahan tell you to do? Silas asked. Beckett's jaw moved slightly. He told me to come up here and assess the situation. And use my judgment, Beckett said. What does your judgment say? Silas asked. Beckett looked at the pen for a long moment. The cattle were watching him with the incurious attention of animals that have no stake in conversations. The rain had picked up slightly, not much, just enough to change the sound of it in the trees. My judgment says this got more complicated than it was supposed to, Beckett said. It was supposed to be a herd that drifted during a river surge. People lose cattle in surges, it happens, he paused. It wasn't supposed to have anyone tracking it. Pope hired a tracker, Silas said. That's what people do with missing cattle. Pope hired you, specifically, Beckett said. That's different, Silas said nothing. I know who you are, Beckett said. Not just from yesterday. Your name moves around in certain kinds of circles. You worked federal marshal's office out of Cheyenne. You tracked the Denton brothers across 4 territories in '82. He paused. Before that is older business, and I don't know all of it. He looked at Silas directly. Point is, moving cattle past you is different from moving cattle past most men. It's not different, Silas said. Cattle leave sign. That doesn't change because of who's reading it. Maybe, Beckett said. But most men read it wrong, or quit when the terrain gets difficult, or decide the job isn't worth the trouble. He let that sit for a moment. You didn't quit. No, Silas said. I didn't. Beckett turned something over. Silas could see the calculation behind his eyes, the weighing of options, the assessment of consequences. This was a man who had been operating for 2 years inside a structure that had been working, and now the structure had a visible crack in it, and he was trying to determine how bad the crack was, and whether it could be managed. What do you want? Beckett said. I want Pope's cattle returned to Pope's land with a written accounting of where they've been and who moved them, Silas said. I want that counting signed and witnessed, and I want it in Roy Garrett's hands before the end of the week. Beckett looked at him for a long time. You know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking, Silas said. The question is what you're willing to do. If I put my name on a document like that, you'll be the man who documented it, Silas said, rather than the man who was documented. Those are different positions to be in when the circuit judge comes through. Beckett's horse shifted beneath him, responding to something in its rider's body, a tension, a calculation completing itself. The foreman looked at the pen, at the cattle, at the ground between his horse's feet, and then back at Silas. I need time, he said. You have until tomorrow morning, Silas said. That's when Garrett and Pope will arrive, assuming my message got through, which it will, one way or another. Beckett nodded once, turned his horse, and rode back up the north approach without another word. Silas stood in the drizzle and watched him go and held open the question of whether he'd just made a reasonable negotiation or a significant mistake. Roy Garrett arrived at the draw at 10 in the morning with Pope's foreman Ned, and a man Silas didn't recognize, who turned out to be the town's unofficial recorder, a retired schoolteacher named Hobbs, who kept proper ledgers of Larkspur's unofficial business with the precise handwriting of a man who had spent his adult life making 12-year-olds form letters correctly. Garrett looked at the pen and the cattle and the limestone shelf and took it in with the deliberate attention of a man building a case rather than a man having an experience. He said very little for the first 10 minutes. He walked the draw in 3 directions, looked at the horse prints Silas pointed out, crouched at the same spots Silas had crouched at, and stood up with the expression of someone whose suspicions have become confirmations. Pope looked at his cattle with an expression that was harder to read. Not quite relief, it wasn't relief yet, because they weren't home yet, but something related. The expression of a man who has had something taken and has found it intact, and is in the complicated emotional space between the finding and the keeping. 62, Pope said. 62, Silas said. Pope put his hand on the rope fence and looked at his animals. Good, he said. Hobbs set up his ledger on the flat of a limestone rock and began recording. Silas walked him through the evidence point by point, the far bank sign, the organized tracks, the 5 rider positions, the direction of drive, the camp remains, the pen itself, the fresh prints from yesterday and this morning. Hobbs wrote it down with the unhurried precision of a man who understood that these words were going to matter later, and mattered less if they were rushed. You spoke to someone here this morning, Garrett said. One of Callahan's men. Breckett, Silas said, the foreman. Garrett was quiet for a moment. What did he say? Silas told him. All of it, the assessment, the calculation, the offer of time. He didn't editorialize. He laid it out the way he'd laid out the tracking evidence, in sequence, accurately, without shaping it toward a conclusion. Garrett listened. When Silas finished, he was quiet for a little while. Then you gave him until morning, yes, Silas said. If he comes back with a signed accounting. It's evidence, Silas said. Better evidence than what we have now, which is physical sign and one man's account of what he found. A signed statement from the man who executed the operation is a different level of documentation. If he comes back at all, Garrett said. If he doesn't, Silas said, then we have what we have, and you take it to the circuit judge in 6 weeks, and we see what happens. Garrett looked at him. And between now and 6 weeks. I know, Silas said. They looked at each other, the two of them, two older men standing in the rain in a draw in the Wyoming high range, both aware of the gap between what evidence could do in 6 weeks and what money and armed men could do in 6 weeks, and both aware that the gap was not theoretical. There's something else, Garrett said. He said it carefully, with the particular weight of a man who has been holding a piece of information and deciding when to put it down. Silas waited. Cora Whitfield had visitors last night, Garrett said. 3 men after dark. They didn't identify themselves. They told her the offer was being withdrawn and replaced with a deadline. He paused. 2 weeks to vacate. They said if she didn't vacate, the county assessor would find irregularities in her land title. Silas felt something in his chest that wasn't quite anger. It was colder than anger, more deliberate. Her title is clean? Her husband filed it properly in 1876, Garrett said. I've seen the original document. It's clean. He looked at the ground between them. But manufacturing an irregularity isn't impossible if you have the right relationships with the right county offices, and Callahan has been building those relationships for 2 years. She's alone, Silas said. Her nephew's there, Garrett said. He's 17. Silas looked at the cattle in the pen. He thought about the shape of the pattern, not random, not opportunistic, sequential, methodic. The barn fire, the equipment, the escalating pressure, the purchased relationships. The pattern did not stop when confronted, it adapted. It found new angles. It kept moving, because the man directing it had calculated that the cost of stopping was higher than the cost of continuing. That calculation was about to need revising. Take the cattle home, Silas said to Pope. Get them branded fresh and documented. Don't wait for Breckett. Pope looked at him. What are you going to do? Check on a neighbor, Silas said. The Whitfield place was 8 miles south, on land that ran along a creek bottom, before rising into a south-facing hillside that caught more sun than the surrounding terrain good land. Well chosen by someone who understood what they were looking at when they picked it. The improvements were modest but maintained, a solid house, a barn that had been repaired recently, fencing in good repair along the creek boundary, the work of people who intended to stay. Silas rode in openly at a walk, which was the only reasonable approach to a property where a woman alone with a 17-year-old had just received night visitors with threats attached. He called out from 20 yards out, Silas Crowe, cattle tracker. I'm riding for Aldous Pope. I mean no harm, and I'll stay at distance if you prefer. There was a pause, the particular quality of pause that happens when someone inside a building is deciding. Then the front door opened and a woman appeared in it. She was not what he'd expected, though he couldn't have said precisely what he'd expected. She was maybe 45, with dark hair going gray at the temples, wearing work-clothes trousers, boots, a heavy shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold. She was not holding a weapon, but she stood in the doorway the way people stand when they know where the weapons are, and could be holding one within 4 seconds. She looked at Silas the way she'd probably looked at the 3 men last night, measuring. Crow, she said. Roy Garrett mentioned your name this morning. He sent a boy with a note. Garrett moved fast, Silas thought. Then you know why I'm here. Come in, she said. The coffee's on. The inside of the Whitfield house had the quality of a place that had been built around a life rather than for appearance. There were books, actual books, not just the one Bible that most frontier households kept for respectability in 2 shelves along the wall, a writing desk with papers that looked like ledgers, property records, correspondence. The kitchen table was clear and the floor was clean, and the whole place had an organized density that took someone who worked hard and thought carefully about how space was used. The nephew was in the kitchen. He was 17 and trying very hard to look older, which Silas recognizes the specific effort of a young man who understands that the situation requires more than he currently is, but hasn't yet worked out how to bridge that gap. His name was Cal, and he had his aunt's dark eyes and a jaw that was still settling into its adult shape. Cora Whitfield poured coffee and sat across from Silas and folded her hands on the table, and looked at him with an expression that had no particular softness in it, which Silas respected. People who led with softness in situations like this one were either naive or performing, and she was clearly neither. "Tell me what you found up on the range," she said. He told her. All of it: the crossing, the drive, the pen, Breckett, the morning conversation. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment, processing. "So, the cattle can be proven stolen," she said, "with documentation. If Breckett signs," Silas said. "And possibly even without it, depending on what the circuit judge decides to do with physical evidence. The circuit judge comes through in 5 weeks," she said. "I have 2, I know," Silas said. "What did the men say exactly last night?" "The ones who came." She repeated it, with the precision of someone who had been turning it over all night. The 2-week deadline, the vacate notice, the land title threat. She remembered the words in sequence, which meant she'd committed them to memory intentionally. She was a woman who documented things, even in her head, even when she had no paper in front of her. "Did they threaten physical harm?" Silas asked. "Not directly," she said. "They were careful about that. One of them said something about how accidents happened on remote properties, how it was hard to get help in time. He said it like a weather observation." Her jaw tightened slightly. He was smiling when he said it. "You know who they were?" "2 of them I recognized as double C hands," she said. "The third one I didn't know. He was the one who spoke. The other 2 were just furniture, standing around to make the room feel smaller." "Can you describe the third man?" She did. Mid-40s, lean, pale eyes, a scar below his left ear from something old. The kind of description that was specific enough to be useful, and came from someone who had looked carefully. "He wasn't a ranch hand," Silas said. "No," she agreed. "He wasn't." She poured more coffee into both cups, without asking if he wanted it, which meant she had more to say and was preparing to say it. Silas waited. "I have letters," she said, 3 of them from the past 6 months. From other ranchers in the valley, 2 of them have already sold. The letters describe what was done to them before they sold, the escalation, what was said, what happened to their property, what the final offer looked like. She looked at her hands on the table. "They wrote to me because they felt guilty, because they'd told me to hold on, and then they didn't hold on themselves, and they wanted to explain, I suppose." "Those letters are evidence," Silas said. "I know," she said. "I've had them in a locked box because I didn't know what to do with them." "Hobbs the recorder," Silas said. "Do you know him?" "Old school teacher? Yes. He's up on the range right now documenting the pen site," Silas said. "When he comes back to town, you give him those letters. He makes official copies and puts them in the community record alongside what I found today." He paused. "That's 3 separate categories of documentation. The physical evidence from the drive, the letters describing the pattern, whatever Breckett signs if he signs. Put all 3 together and you have something the circuit judge can work with." Cora looked at him steadily. "That's still 5 weeks," she said. "Yes," Silas said, "and in 5 weeks, I know," he said. For the 3rd time this morning, he kept saying it because it kept being true, and because there was no clean answer for it, and he would rather acknowledge a real problem than offer a false solution. She looked at him for a moment. Then something shifted in her face, not softness, but a different kind of steadiness. The kind that comes when someone has been carrying a weight alone for a long time and has just been given, not the weight removed, but someone standing on the other side of it. "What do you need?" she said. "Those letters," Silas said, "and anything else you've documented, and a description of every visit, every offer, every incident you can remember, in writing, dated and signed." He paused. "And I need to know everything you know about the third man." She stood up. She went to the writing desk and unlocked the box. She came back with 3 letters and sat down and looked at them for a moment before setting them in front of Silas. "His name," she said, "I found out this morning. Roy Garrett's boy told me when he brought the note." She paused. "He's called Nate Sully. He works for a land acquisition office in Casper. He's done this in 2 other counties before this one." Silas looked at the letters. He looked at her. "A land acquisition office, which means someone above Callahan," she said, "or someone beside him. Either way, Callahan isn't the top of this." The room got very quiet. This was the thing about patterns sometimes when you tracked them far enough. What you found was not the shape you'd started looking for, but a larger one underneath it. 2 years of methodical valley consolidation. A professional who'd run the same operation in 2 other counties. A land acquisition office in Casper with the resources to purchase legal complication. This was not a rancher with ambitions. This was a machine, and Callahan was one of its working parts. Cal, the nephew, had been quiet in the kitchen doorway for the past 10 minutes. Silas had been aware of him listening, cataloging, turning things over. The boy had his aunt's way of being still while processing, which was a better quality in a 17-year-old than most of what 17-year-olds demonstrated. "What do we do?" Cal said. Both adults looked at him. He held the look without flinching, which Silas noted. "We document everything," Silas said. "And then we make sure the documentation is in enough places and with enough people that losing any one copy doesn't lose the case. And between now and 5 weeks? Cal said. He was asking the same question as Anne had asked, but he was asking it from a different angle, not about legal process, but about the practical reality of 2 people on a remote property with a 2-week deadline from men who smiled while discussing accidents. Silas looked at the boy for a moment, then he looked at Cora. "Do you have room for one more in the barn?" he said. Cora looked at him carefully. "You're staying." "I have a tracking job," he said. "The job found the cattle. The cattle aren't home yet. I'll see it through." It wasn't the whole truth, and she probably knew it, but she didn't press. She had the good sense to take the offer for what it was, rather than for what it was fully composed of. "There's a cot in the tack room," she said. "It's not comfortable. It's better than limestone," he said. Beckett came back the next morning. Silas was in the yard when the foreman rode in, not because he'd been watching for him specifically, but because he'd been in the yard since before sunrise, which was where he'd been every morning since he could remember. He waited while Beckett dismounted and tied his horse and walked over with the deliberate pace of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it, but is not entirely comfortable with it. He had a folded paper in his coat. "It's signed," Beckett said. "The cattle were moved on my order during the river surge on the 14th. I have the names of the 4 men who rode the drive, the location of the pen, and the condition of the animals at time of my last inspection." He held out the paper. "I've named the order source." Silas took the paper and unfolded it. He read it in the gray morning light, slowly, not for the information he knew the information, but for the precision and completeness, looking for omissions that could be used as escape hatches later. It was precise. It was complete. It named Garrett Beckett as the executing party, and it named the source of the order above him. "Why?" Silas said. Beckett looked at the house. He looked at the barn. He looked at the yard, the work of it, the ordinariness of it. A property that was somebody's life laid out in lumber and fence post and worn ground. "Because I've been doing this for 2 years, he said, "and I told myself it was just ranch business. Competition for land, that's what it is in one way of looking at it." He paused. "Then I rode out yesterday afternoon and saw who I was riding out against." He looked at Silas. A widow woman and a boy. Silas folded the paper. "You know this doesn't protect you from what you've already done." "I know that," Beckett said. "I've got a lawyer in Casper who's going to know what I've done by end of week." He looked at his horse. "I'm not looking for protection. I'm looking to stop building more of a thing I shouldn't have started building." He rode out without another word. Silas stood in the yard with the folded paper in his hand and thought about the particular way that men arrived at their better selves, not cleanly, not heroically, but through the accumulation of small wrong turns until suddenly the view from that road became impossible to keep looking at. He took the paper inside. Cora was at the writing desk with her own papers spread out. She had been writing since before he'd gone outside. He'd heard the scratch of her pen through the wall of the tack room in the early dark, and he'd understood it for what it was. A woman building the documentary record of the last 2 years while the record could still be built. Cal was in the barn, doing morning chores, the kind of ordinary work that holds a life together even when the life is under pressure. She looked at the folded paper in his hand. "Beckett came," she said. "Beckett came," he confirmed. He set the paper on the desk beside her own work. She looked at it for a moment without unfolding it. "It changes things," she said. "It changes some things," he said. "Not all of them." She unfolded it. She read it with the same careful precision with which she did everything, and when she finished reading, she set it flat on the desk and put her hand on it, the way you put your hand on something you don't want to move. "Nate Sully," she said. "Yes," Silas said. "He's still coming," she said. "The deadline doesn't change because of this paper. He doesn't know this paper exists." "Not yet," Silas said. She looked at him. "You have a plan." "I have the beginning of one," Silas said, "which is different." Outside, Cal was leading the horse out of the barn into the thin morning sun that had broken through after 2 days of rain, a brief clearance, the kind that didn't promise to hold. The boy moved with a quiet competence around the animal, checking the girth, adjusting the bridle, not rushing it. He was learning, Silas thought. Not just the horsework, but the other thing, the way you carry yourself, when the situation is larger than you are, and you're the only one available. There was something worth preserving in this yard. Not the specific things, the lumber, the fence posts, the water from the creek, but the arrangement of them. The decision a woman had made 7 years ago, after her husband died, to stay and work what was hers rather than retreat to something easier. The decision that was still being made every morning by the fact of the fires being lit, and the horses being fed, and the papers being written in the early dark. Callahan and the land acquisition office in Casper had looked at this and seen an obstacle to be removed. They had sent a smiling man with a deadline and an implied threat about accidents on remote properties, and they had assumed that the weight of the machine behind them would be sufficient. They had not accounted for the paper on the desk, or the letters in the box, or the recording Hobbs was making in his careful ledger, or the man sleeping in the tack room on a cot that was not comfortable. Silas looked out at the yard, at Cal and the horse, at the thin sun on the fence posts, at the creek line in the distance marking the south boundary of 240 acres that belonged to the woman behind him. Then he went to find a piece of paper and started writing a letter to a federal marshal he knew in Cheyenne, a man named Aldridge who was honest, which was, as Roy Garrett had noted about the circuit judge, somewhat unusual around here, but not impossible to find if you knew where to look. He wrote it carefully, with the specific kind of care that goes into a letter that needs to do work without the writer being present to explain it. He named Nate Sully. He named the land acquisition office in Casper. He named the 2 other counties where the same operation had run. He gave the dates and the pattern and referenced the documentation that existed and where it was held. He did not ask for anything specific. He simply laid out what he had found and let the shape of it speak for itself, which was what good evidence did when it was handled correctly. At the bottom he wrote his name and the name of the valley and the date. He folded it and addressed it and looked at it for a moment. Then he set it down next to Brackett's signed statement on Cora Whitfield's writing desk, and he went outside to help Cal with the horses, because the morning work still needed doing regardless of everything else, and that was the other thing worth preserving. The ordinary continuation of a life that refused to be interrupted by men who assumed it could be. The letter to Aldridge went out with Roy Garrett's boy on the morning of the 3rd day, tucked inside a second envelope addressed to a freight office in Casper that Silas trusted to forward it without losing it or reading it, which was a narrower category of freight office than most people assumed. Garrett had read the letter before it was sealed Silas had offered, and Garrett had accepted without pretending he didn't want to, which was another thing Silas respected about the man. He'd read it standing at Cora's writing desk, with his reading glasses on and his mouth in a thin line, and when he finished he folded it carefully along its original creases and handed it back. "Aldridge is good?" Garrett asked. "Aldridge is the best federal marshal I've worked with," Silas said, "which doesn't mean he's fast. The office moves at its own pace." "How long?" 3 weeks if the letter reaches him quickly and he takes it seriously immediately. 5 or 6 if it sits on his desk for a while first." Silas paused. "He'll take it seriously. The pattern I described is the kind of thing the federal office has been trying to document for 2 years in this territory. This gives them the documentation." Garrett folded his glasses and put them in his pocket. "And Sully's deadline is 12 days. "Yes," Silas said. "So there's a gap." "There's a gap," Silas said. "There's always a gap." That was the truth of it, and both men knew it, the truth that no one in positions like theirs ever fully solved, only managed. The law moved in its own time, with its own requirements, and the space between what the law needed and what the situation demanded was where most of the actual living happened. Most of the dying, too. Garrett left that morning to ride back to Larkspur, carrying Hobbs's completed record of the draw site and Brackett's signed statement and copies of Cora's letters. All of it to be filed in the community ledger that Hobbs maintained, and that existed as a kind of informal public record for a town that had no formal courthouse of its own. It was not a perfect system. It was the system available. Silas watched him ride out and then turned back to the Whitfield yard. The days had a shape to them that Silas settled into without planning to. He was up before the house, which meant before Cora, who was up before the sun, which was early enough that the distinction between night and morning was more philosophical than practical. He did the first circuit of the property in the dark, the perimeter, the approaches, the creek line moving quietly, reading the ground for anything that didn't belong. It was the same thing he'd done in Indian Territory in his 30s, in the mining camps in his 40s, in the unnamed stretches of open country that had constituted most of his working life, the pre-dawn reading of a landscape for signs of intention. Nothing came in the first 4 days. Cal helped with the circuit on the second morning, appearing at Silas's elbow at the barn door before first light with his boots on and his coat buttoned wrong in the dark. Silas didn't tell him to go back inside. He corrected the coat buttons without comment, and they walked the perimeter together in silence, the boy learning the pattern by following it, which was the only way the pattern could be learned. On the third morning, Cal walked half of it himself, in the opposite direction, and they met at the creek line and compared what they'd seen, and Cal had noticed a thing that Silas had noticed, a section of fence on the east boundary, where the wire had been touched recently. Not cut, just handled. The way you handle a fence when you're testing it, rather than meaning to cross it yet. "When?" Silas asked. "Sometime yesterday," Cal said. "The grass is bent different there. It wasn't like that 2 days ago." Silas crouched at the spot. The boy was right, the grass pattern, the slight disturbance in the soil at the post base. Someone had stood here, probably on horseback, probably for less than 5 minutes, and had put their hand on the wire, testing the property, measuring it. "You've got good eyes," Silas said. Cal absorbed this without either dismissing it or making too much of it. My uncle taught me to read fences, he said, before he died. He said a fence tells you everything about who's been near a place. He was right, Silas said. They walked back to the house in the thin pre-dawn, and Silas told Cora what Cal had found, and she received it in the way she received everything without visible alarm, with the focused attention of someone converting information directly into planning. They're watching the property, she said. Measuring it, Silas said. That's different from coming in. They want to know what they're dealing with before they commit to an approach. Because of you, she said. Maybe, Silas said. Or because they're careful. Both, she said. She was right. Sully struck him as a careful man, the kind who did reconnaissance before action, who preferred a clear picture of the situation to the confidence of numbers. The three men who'd come to deliver the deadline had not been a threat in themselves. They'd been an assessment tool, measuring the response, reading the situation the way you read a fence. What they'd found was a property with an extra horse in the barn and boot prints in the yard from someone larger than the woman and the boy. That had changed their timeline. Silas was counting on it. On the fifth day, Wade Callahan came. Not with 40 men, not with the armed approach of a man demonstrating force. He came with 2 riders flanking him at a respectful distance, which was the approach of a man demonstrating status rather than threat, and he rode into the Whitfield yard at mid-morning like someone paying a social call. Silas was on the porch when he arrived. He had been there for 20 minutes, because the roan had told him a particular quality of attention, in the horse's ears that meant riders approaching from the north, at a distance that was still beyond human hearing. He'd told Cora, who had put on a different coat and come to stand in the doorway behind him, which was the right position, present, not retreating, not aggressive. Cal was in the barn. Silas had told him to stay there and stay quiet, and Cal had accepted this without arguing, which showed better judgment than most men twice his age. Wade Callahan was not what Silas had constructed from the available description. He was smaller than expected, not short but compact, with none of the physical largeness that powerful men sometimes cultivated to match their reputation. He was 55 or close to it, with gray at his temples, and a face that had the arranged pleasantness of someone who had learned that pleasantness was a more effective instrument than hostility in most situations. He was well dressed for a ranch visit, not ostentatiously but deliberately. He had thought about what he wore to this yard, which told you something. He looked at Silas on the porch for a moment, then looked at Cora in the doorway, then back at Silas. "Mr. Crowe," he said. "Mr. Callahan," Silas said. Callahan dismounted with the ease of a man who had spent his life on horses. He handed his reins to one of the flanking riders without looking at the man, the gesture of someone accustomed to that service. He walked toward the porch and stopped at the bottom of the steps, not coming up uninvited, observing that form. "I'd like to talk," he said. "You're talking," Silas said. A slight adjustment in Callahan's arranged pleasantness, not breaking, just recalibrating. "I was hoping for something more civil than a porch conversation." "The porch is civil," Silas said. "What would you like to say?" Callahan looked at the yard. He looked at the barn, the fence lines, the creek in the distance. He looked at it with the specific quality of attention that a man gives to something he's been planning to own, and Silas watched him do it and let him. "I want to resolve this situation," Callahan said. "The whole of it. What happened in Larkspur, the cattle question, Mrs. Whitfield's land." He put his hands in his coat pockets in a way that was probably meant to look relaxed and landed slightly short of it. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about intentions. My foreman acted without full authorization in the matter of the Pope cattle. That's being corrected." Breckett signed a statement, Silas said, "naming you as the order source." A pause, calibration. "Breckett is a man with his own interests," Callahan said carefully. "I wouldn't put too much weight on what a man writes when he's trying to manage his own situation." "The physical evidence doesn't have interests," Silas said. "The pen location, the drive tracks, the camp remains. Those are in Hobbs's record, witnessed and filed." Callahan was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who showed what calculations were running behind his face, but you could see the faint evidence of them, a slight tension around the jaw. A pause that was a fraction longer than conversational rhythm required. "What do you want, Mr. Crowe?" he said. It was a direct question, and Silas had expected it, the move of a man who has found the indirect approach obstructed and is trying the direct one to see if the price is manageable. "I don't want anything from you," Silas said. "Mrs. Whitfield wants her property to remain hers. Pope wants his cattle home with documentation of where they've been. Roy Garrett wants the pattern of the last 2 years to stop." He paused. "Those are the things that are in front of you, Mr. Callahan. What you do with them is your decision." "In the matter of my son," Callahan said. His voice had shifted, not softer exactly, but with a different quality. This was the thing under everything else, the thing that had ridden here ahead of all the other things, dressed in different language. Silas looked at him. Your son drew on a man who had his back turned, he said. In front of 30 witnesses, I responded. He kept his voice even, not unkind. He's alive and he'll heal. What happens after that depends on the decisions he makes, not on anything I've done. He's 23 years old, Callahan said. I know how old he is, Silas said, which is old enough to be accountable for a decision like that one. Something moved through Callahan's face, something that was not the arranged pleasantness and was not the calculation either. Something older and less managed. A father looking at the consequence of raising a son on a diet of winning, of being told that the contest was the measure, of surrounding him with men who laughed when old cowboys lost their money and cried about it. There was a cost to that kind of raising that had arrived in Larkspur in the form of a shoulder wound and a public humiliation, and it was sitting on Wade Callahan's chest, and he knew it, and there was nothing in the valley or the territory or the land acquisition office in Casper that could take it off him. I'm not asking you to account for it, Silas said, quietly, without performance. I'm telling you that the accounting is between your son and himself. That's where it belongs. Callahan was quiet for a long time. One of the flanking riders shifted in his saddle. The other was very still. Cora in the doorway had not moved. The cattle will be returned to Pope by end of week, Callahan said finally, with a written correction of the record from my office. Silas said nothing. He waited. The deadline for this property is withdrawn, Callahan said. He did not look at Cora when he said it. Mrs. Whitfield's title is not in dispute. More waiting. Callahan looked at the barn, at the fence lines, at the ground. The land acquisition activities in this valley are being suspended, he said. Each word placed carefully, the way you place weight on ice you're not certain of. I need time to review my business arrangements, Nate Sully, Silas said. The name landed. Callahan's eyes came back to him. The federal marshal's office in Cheyenne has a letter, Silas said, describing Sully's operation in this valley and 2 others before it. Describing the land acquisition office in Casper and its relationship to the pattern. He paused. That letter was sent 4 days ago. I don't know exactly when it arrives or what Marshal Aldridge does with it. That's outside my control. He looked at Callahan steadily. What's inside your control is what the investigation finds when it looks at your specific role. That's a different thing from Sully's operation, and it's a distinction that the federal office is capable of making, if the distinction is real. The silence this time had a different weight. Callahan stood at the bottom of the porch steps and processed this with the visible effort of a man who has just discovered that the ground he'd been standing on was not as solid as he'd understood, and is recalculating from a position that offers fewer options than he arrived with. I want to speak with a lawyer, Callahan said. That's a reasonable thing to want, Silas said. Callahan looked at him for one more moment, looking for something, Silas thought. Not a deal, and not an argument. Something else. Maybe just confirmation that the thing he was reading in this situation was actually there, and he hadn't misread it. You could have made this much worse, Callahan said. Yes, Silas said. Why didn't you? Silas thought about that for a moment. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because the answer had several layers, and he was choosing which one to offer. Because worse doesn't end things, he said finally. It just moves them to the next person. Callahan looked at him another moment. Then he took his reins back from the flanking rider, mounted, and rode out of the Whitfield yard the way he'd ridden in at a walk, without hurry, the 2 riders falling in behind him. He did not look back. Silas watched him go. Cora came to stand beside him on the porch. You think he means it, she said. It was not quite a question. I think he's a man who just found out that the machine he was part of is bigger than he understood, Silas said, and that his name is on parts of it that he might not have known were there. That changes a man's priorities. He paused. I think he means the parts that are in his direct control. The rest Sully, the Casper office, that's somebody else's decision. And Sully, she said. Sully will hear about Aldridge's investigation before Aldridge gets here, Silas said. Men like Sully have ears in the right places. When he hears it, he'll make a calculation about what his best move is. He looked at the road Callahan had taken, now empty. His best move isn't this valley anymore. Cora was quiet for a moment. You're guessing, she said. About Sully, yes, Silas said. The rest is evidence. She stood beside him looking at the yard. The sun was at mid-morning height now, clear and direct, putting hard shadows under the fence posts and along the barn wall. It was the kind of morning that had no particular feeling attached to it, just light and cold and the smell of the creek and the ordinary requirements of a working property. I don't know how to thank you, she said. You don't need to, he said. I didn't do this as a favor. What did you do it as? He thought about that. A job that kept expanding, he said. I came to track cattle. The cattle led somewhere. The somewheres led here. He paused. It would have been strange to stop in the middle. She looked at him. You could have stopped at the draw, she said. You found the cattle. That was the job. You could have handed it to Garrett and ridden to the next thing. I could have, he said. She waited, and when he didn't continue, he looked at the yard, at the fence Cal had noticed, at the creek line, at the careful ordinariness of a life that someone had built and maintained for 7 years against the specific effort of time and loss, and now deliberate pressure. He thought about what Roy Garrett had said that first night in Larkspur, standing beside him in the street. Nothing has moved it. Some things deserve to not be moved, he said. Sully came on the 10th day, not to the Whitfield property to Larkspur, which Silas had not predicted but probably should have. He arrived in the early afternoon with one man beside him and tied up outside the Buckhorn, and went in and sat at a table and ordered a drink. And Roy Garrett's network, which was informal but effective, had Silas informed within 2 hours. He rode into Larkspur in the late afternoon and found Sully at the table where Garrett had described him. The man matched Cora's description, precisely lean, pale-eyed, the scar below his left ear. He was drinking slowly and watching the room with the detached attention of someone who has learned to process environments the same way he processed everything, as information to be assessed. He saw Silas come in. He watched him cross to the table. He did not move his hands or call to the man beside him, who was sitting at the bar and who had the shape of a man paid to be adjacent to trouble. Silas sat down across from him. "You're Crowe," Sully said. "Yes," Silas said. "I figured you'd find me eventually," Sully said. "I came here to save time." "That's considerate," Silas said. Sully almost smiled. It didn't reach the pale eyes. "I want to know what's in the letter to Aldridge." "What makes you think I'll tell you?" "Because you want this finished," Sully said. "And I can help finish it in a way that's cleaner than a federal investigation, which takes years and doesn't always end where you want it." Silas looked at him. Sully was composed, professionally composed, the way people are when composure is a tool they use rather than a condition they're in. Underneath it, reading the small signals the body produced below the level of conscious control, Silas could see that the man was recalculating. He had come here for information, which meant his information was incomplete, which meant the letter had moved faster than he'd expected. "Aldridge has the pattern," Silas said. 3 counties, the same operation. The Casper office. Your name attached to the execution in each one. He paused. He has Brackett's signed statement and Hobbs's record of the draw site. He has letters from 2 ranchers who've already sold, describing what happened before they sold. He let that land. He has enough to open a formal investigation, which puts names in federal record that don't come out of federal record easily. Sully was quiet. "What he doesn't have yet," Silas said, "is testimony from someone who was inside the operation. Someone who could describe how it worked above the county level. The Casper office, who authorized it, how the acquisition funds moved." He looked at Sully directly. "That testimony would change the shape of what happens next, and not just for you." Sully turned his glass on the table. Once. Twice. He was thinking Silas could feel it, the weight of the calculation. "You're asking me to cooperate with a federal investigation," Sully said. "I'm describing what exists and what's missing," Silas said. "What you do with that description is your decision. And if I walk out of here right now, then the investigation runs on what it has," Silas said, "which is enough to be serious. And whatever protection you've had from the people above you in this protection that requires them to be free and functional to provide becomes less reliable over time." The pale eyes moved. A calculation completing. "The people above me," Sully said carefully, "are not people who appreciate complications." "No," Silas said, "they wouldn't be." More silence. The man at the bar had turned on his stool to watch, the way a dog watches its owner when the owner's voice changes. Sully didn't look at him. "I need guarantees," Sully said. "From Aldridge directly, not from a cattle tracker." "I can get you Aldridge directly," Silas said. "Garrett can send a wire to Cheyenne today." Sully looked at the table, at the glass. At some point that had no physical location. "The operation in the other 2 counties," he said. "There are people who lost property in those counties." "I know," Silas said. "What Aldridge does with what I give him, I can't control where that goes." "No," Silas said. "You can't." Sully looked at him. For the first time in the conversation, something moved behind the professional composure, not guilt exactly, not remorse, but something adjacent to both. Something that might become either of those things given enough time and enough quiet. The specific expression of a man who has been operating at a comfortable remove from the consequences of his work and has just had the distance collapsed. "I want the wire sent today," Sully said. "Garrett can send it within the hour," Silas said. Sully nodded once. He set down his glass. He stood up and looked at Silas for a moment with the expression of a man filing something away, not gratitude, not resentment, something more complicated than either. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" Silas said. "Someone looking for a bigger cut," Sully said. "Someone working an angle." "I track cattle," Silas said. "That's the job." Sully looked at him one more moment, then walked out of the Buckhorn with his man behind him. And Silas sat at the table with the untouched drink and listened to the ordinary sound of the saloon reforming around the space where something had just happened. Aldridge's response came by wire 6 days later, terse, professional. Exactly what Silas had expected from a man who dealt in compressed language out of necessity. He confirmed receipt of the letter. He confirmed a federal inquiry was being opened into the Casper Land Acquisition Office. He confirmed that a deputy would be in the valley within 3 weeks to take formal statements. Roy Garrett read the wire in his feed store and then read it again, and then set it on the counter and put both hands flat on the counter and breathed for a moment. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, Silas confirmed. Garrett looked at him. Callahan? His lawyer sent a letter to Hobbs 2 days ago, Silas said, acknowledging the return of Pope's cattle and withdrawing the land acquisition offers in the valley. He's distancing from the Casper office. He paused. Whether that's enough to keep him clear of the federal inquiry is Aldridge's question, not mine. And Sully gave his statement to Garrett directly, Silas said. Garrett sent it to Cheyenne with the wire yesterday. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. He looked out the feed store window at the main street of Larkspur, the same street, the same buildings, the same general disorder of a frontier town that had grown without planning and hadn't gotten around to fixing that. Nothing about it looked different than it had 10 days ago. 2 years, Garrett said. Yes, Silas said. We wrote letters, Garrett said. We talked to the commissioner. We talked to the circuit judge. He shook his head slowly. And what it took was a man who came in for a drink on a Thursday afternoon. It took the letters, Silas said, and the talking. And Cora holding her land and Pope refusing to sell and you keeping the record for 2 years. All of that was in place before I got here. He paused. I just tracked where the trail went. Garrett looked at him. You do that a lot? Reduce your own contribution. I reduce it accurately, Silas said. There's a difference. Garrett almost laughed. It was the first time in the conversation that his face had done anything except process weight. Pope's cattle made it home on the 8th day. Silas rode with the small group that brought them back down from the high-range Pope Ned and 2 hands, moving 62 animals through the broken country and back down to the valley floor in a drive that took most of the day. The cattle were in reasonable condition, better than they might have been given the circumstances. Pope walked among them in his own yard when they arrived, doing his count, touching the ones he recognized, which was most of them because he was a man who knew his animals as individuals and had made no apology for it. He reached 62 and stood in his yard in the late afternoon and looked at nothing in particular for a long moment. 62, he said. 62, Ned confirmed. Pope nodded. He turned and found Silas. What do I owe you? The agreed rate for the tracking, Silas said. Nothing more. Pope looked at him with the expression he'd worn the first morning calibrated, measuring, the gunmetal eyes running their calculation. The tracking was 3 days of work. What came after was different. What came after was the trail, Silas said. That's still tracking. Pope went inside. He came back with an envelope. He held it out and Silas took it without opening it. There's more in there than the rate, Pope said. Don't argue with me about it. I'm 63 years old and I'm tired and my cattle are home. Silas put the envelope in his coat. Stay for supper, Pope said. He stayed for supper. He went back to the Whitfield place the next morning. Not because anything required it, the immediate danger had passed. The documentation was in the right hands. The federal deputy was coming. He went because there was a fence section on the east boundary that needed a proper repair rather than the temporary fix they'd done on day 5. And because Cal had asked him 3 days earlier how you read old track on rocky ground, and Silas had said he'd show him, and he did not make offers he didn't intend to keep. Cal was in the yard when he rode in. The boy had been watching for him. Silas could tell from how quickly he appeared, and the quality of the appearance, the way someone materializes when they've been positioned rather than when they've been going about other business. You came back, Cal said. Said I would, Silas said. People say things, Cal said. Yes, Silas said, they do. He dismounted and tied the roan and looked at the boy. Get your horse. We'll fix the fence first, and then I'll show you the rocky ground tracking. It'll take most of the morning. Cal went for his horse without another word, which was exactly the right response. They fixed the fence in an hour proper repair, not temporary, driving the post back to true depth and resetting the wire at correct tension so it would hold through winter. Cal worked well with tools, attentive to what Silas showed him and quick to apply it, without the particular male habit of pretending to already know things you're learning. He was a good student because he was willing to actually be a student, which was rarer than it should have been. Afterward, Silas took him north along the creek line to where the bank went rocky and showed him how to read the compressed ground between stones, where animals placed their feet when they couldn't avoid the rock, how the soil built up against the uphill faces of embedded stones, how a print that didn't look like a print revealed itself if you changed the angle of your light. Cal crouched in the position Silas showed him and looked at the ground from the right angle and found what Silas had pointed him toward. 3 days old, deer, 4 animals moving together. the faint depression of each hoof measurable against the stone face, if you knew where to put your eye. He looked up at Silas with the expression of someone who has just learned that a language exists that they hadn't known about. Everything leaves something, Silas said. Even on rock, Cal said. Especially on rock, Silas said. Rock is honest. It doesn't smooth things out. Cal looked at the ground again, studying it now with a different attention, not just the specific things Silas had shown him, but the broader principle. The idea that the landscape was a record if you knew the grammar of it. Silas watched him look and thought about all the men who had shown him things over his life trackers. Lawmen, ranchers, men whose names he carried in specific association with specific knowledge, the way you carry a tool in a specific place because that's where you always put it. Most of them were dead now. That was the arithmetic of a long life, and it didn't get easier, but you got better at carrying it. Cora was at the writing desk when they came back in. She had been corresponding, Silas could see from the number of written sheets and the ink bottle open beside her, with someone at length, multiple letters, the kind of sustained writing that was not practical but personal. She put the pen down when they came in and looked at Cal. "Good morning," she asked him. "He showed me the rock reading," Cal said. He stopped, looking for the right word. "It's like looking at something, and then looking at it again and seeing more the second time." "Yes," Cora said. She looked at Silas. "That's a good description." She made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, and the morning moved around them with the particular quality of mornings that have no immediate emergency attached, slower, with room in them for other things to occupy the space that urgency usually fills. "What will you do, Cora?" asked Silas when this is finished. "It's largely finished now," Silas said. "The deputy comes in 2 weeks. The statements are made. The cattle are home." He turned his cup. "I'll be on the road by end of week, probably." "Another tracking job?" she asked. "There usually is one," he said. She looked at her coffee. She stopped. Started again. "Do you ever want to stop?" "The moving." He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said, "in the way that you want things that you don't quite know how to want. The wanting and the knowing what to do about it aren't the same thing." She looked at him. She had the quality of listening that some people have, not just receiving words, but actually tracking what's behind them, the shape the speaker is navigating around. "My husband wanted to stop moving," she said. "That's why we came here. He'd been 3 different places in 10 years, and he said he wanted to put his feet on ground that he'd stay on." She looked at the window. "He died 4 years after we filed the title. Fever, nothing dramatic. Just sick and then sicker and then gone." She paused. "I used to think the wanting to stop was what mattered. Now I think it's more complicated than that." "What do you think now?" Silas asked. "I think stopping is a choice you keep making," she said, "not a thing you do once. Every morning you get up and you choose the property and the fence and the cattle and the boy, and that's the stopping. It's not one decision. It's accumulated decisions." She looked at him. "The moving is the same, probably." He turned that over. It had the quality of a thing he'd known without knowing he knew it, presented in language that made it visible. "Cal," he said, "when the deputy comes, tell him everything. Don't leave things out because you think they're small. The small things are often where the important details live." Cal nodded. "And the rock reading," Silas said, "practice it. Not just on rock, on every surface. Learn what the ground says in each kind of material, and then learn how the materials change with weather and season. It takes years. Start now." Cal looked at him with an expression that was trying not to be too much of anything, and not quite succeeding. He was 17, and someone had just handed him a thing that felt significant, and he didn't have the experience yet to receive it casually. "Yes, sir," Cal said. Silas looked at the boy, really looked at him, the way you look at something when you're making a memory of it. 17, and growing into his uncle's fence reading and his aunt's stillness, and something else that was entirely his own. Something not yet fully formed that would be good when it finished forming. The valley would be better for having him in it. He looked at Cora, who was watching him with the expression of a woman who sees what's happening and chooses not to name it, which was its own kind of generosity. "The tack room cot," he said, "is not comfortable," she said. "It was adequate," he said. Something moved through her face, not a smile exactly, but the territory adjacent to one. "You're welcome to it," she said, "for as long as the job requires." He looked at his coffee cup. He thought about the road and the next tracking job and the accumulated miles of his adult life and the knee that predicted weather and the roan with the scar above his eye and the envelope in his coat that Pope had given him. He thought about what Cora had said. "You keep making the choice." "And a week," he said. "I'll stay until the deputy arrives." She nodded once and picked up her pen. He left on a Friday morning, 8 days later. The deputy, a young federal man named Carver, who was more competent than his youth suggested, and who had a notebook that he filled with the focused thoroughness of someone who understood what was at stake, had arrived 2 days early, which was a first in Silas's experience of federal agencies. Carver had taken statements from Cora, from Pope, from Garrett, from Hobbs, from Breckett, who'd been waiting with his lawyer. He'd taken a signed account from Sully in a meeting at the Buckhorn that lasted 3 hours and produced 17 pages in Carver's notebook. He'd ridden up to the draw with Silas and Ned and confirmed the physical evidence against Hobbs's written record, making his own notes. He had also, on the second day, ridden out to the Double C. What happened in that meeting Silas didn't know directly. Carver was professionally discreet. But Callahan's lawyer arrived in Larkspur the following morning and met with Carver for 2 hours. And afterward there was a document that Carver put in his case and did not describe to anyone. And whatever it contained, the manner of everyone involved when they came out of the meeting, suggested that a line had been drawn in a specific place and that everyone present had agreed on where the line was. It was not a perfect resolution. Silas had never expected one. The ranchers who'd sold in the past 2 years were not getting their land back. The sales had been legal in form even if the conditions around them had not been, and unwinding legal transactions required a different kind of process than what this investigation was designed to do. The Casper Land Acquisition Office would be investigated, which might produce further consequences, and might not, depending on how many layers it had and how cleanly each layer could be documented. Sully would cooperate in exchange for what Carver had offered him, which Silas understood to be reduced charges and the specific kind of federal attention that was better than the alternative. What was resolved, Pope's cattle were home. Whitfield's land was hers. The pattern in the valley had been broken open and documented, and handed to people with the authority to act on it. That was a real thing. It was what was available. Silas had learned long ago to measure outcomes against what was available, rather than against the clean version in which everything was made right, and the cost of what had already happened was somehow recovered. The clean version existed in stories. The real version existed in yards and fence lines and a federal deputy's notebook. He said goodbye to Garrett in the feed store on Thursday evening. Garrett shook his hand and held it for a moment and said nothing, which was the right amount to say. He said goodbye to Pope at the ranch, where Pope was in the yard doing something to the piece of equipment that had been attached to the hand pump when Silas first arrived. He still didn't know what it was for. "What is that thing?" Silas asked. Pope looked at it. "Pump modification," he said, "for winter, so the line doesn't freeze." "Does it work?" "Haven't had a winter yet to test it," Pope said. "Ask me in March." Silas wouldn't be here in March. Pope knew that. The answer was its own kind of joke, and they both understood it. He rode to the Whitfield place Friday morning and tied the roan and stood in the yard for a moment. Cora came out and stood on the porch without the coat she should have been wearing for the temperature, and Cal came out of the barn with a piece of harness in his hands that he'd been repairing. He looked at them, the woman on the porch, and the boy in the yard, and the property around them that was simply itself in the morning light, neither more nor less than what it had always been. Deputy's work is done," he said. "It's in the right hands from here." "I know," Cora said. "The east fence is sound," he said. "Check it again after the first hard freeze. Ground heave can shift the posts." "Cal knows," she said. Cal, who did know, said nothing and held the harness and looked at Silas with an expression that Silas recognized from his own young face in mirrors he'd been in front of long ago, the expression of a boy who understands that something is ending that he didn't know had begun until it was almost over. "The rock reading," Silas said to him. "Every surface," Cal said. "Weather and season." "Good," Silas said. He looked at Cora. She looked back at him with the direct, unglamorous steadiness of a woman who has looked at hard things for a long time and has not looked away from them. "Thank you," she said. "The tracking was the job," he said. "Yes," she said, "it was." He untied the roan and mounted and turned toward the road. He did not look back when he rode out because he had learned long ago that looking back had a cost that the moment rarely justified. The things worth carrying from a place traveled in you rather than in your eyes, and the looking was only needed when you weren't sure what you were taking. He was sure. He took the south road out of the valley, which was longer than the north road, but which ran along the ridge above the creek bottom and gave him a view of the whole valley in the clear morning light. The Pope Ranch to the north, Whitfield's Creekland to the south, the Larkspur Main Street visible at the far end of the valley as a particular density in the landscape. The land looked the way land looks when you've learned something about it, not different, but more itself. More particular, he rode through it. His knee was manageable this morning, cold, but not the deep ache that cost him miles. The roan was moving well on the repaired shoe, his stride even, his ears doing their reading of the world ahead. The sky was the specific clear blue that comes to Wyoming in the weeks between the last warmth and the first real cold, a transitional color that didn't commit to either season, honest about what it was. He thought about the silver dollars. 12 of them, in his coat pocket, collected from the dirt of the Larkspur Street, what felt like a long time ago and was in fact 11 days. He had not spent them. He hadn't thought about them much during the 11 days. But now, riding the ridge with the valley below him, he thought about them, not the money but the thing they represented. 12 tosses, 12 shots, the specific quality of silence that had followed each clean strike, the way the crowd's breathing changed over the course of that afternoon from entertainment to something closer to recognition. He had been good at something for a long time. The skill had cost him things it required, the kind of history that left marks, and most of those marks were not ones he would have chosen. You couldn't be as accurate as he was without having needed to be, without the particular education of situations where accuracy was the difference between the living and the dead. That education had a price that he had paid in installments over 30 years, and he was still paying it in the form of what he carried, and the quality of his sleep and the way his hands settled near the revolver in the dark. But the 12 silver dollars were also just coins with holes through them, proof of nothing, except that his hand had not lost what 30 years had put in it, and that the afternoon in Larkspur had given him something unexpected, a reason to use the skill for something other than survival. A contest, absurd and unnecessary, that had led to a trail, that had led to a draw in the high range, that had led to an east fence on a creek-bottom property, that had led to a deputy's notebook and a federal inquiry and 62 cattle home. He hadn't planned any of it. He had ridden into Larkspur for a drink. That was the thing about trails. They didn't announce their significance at the start. You followed what was in front of you, step by step, reading the ground as it came, and the shape of where you'd been only became visible when you'd gone far enough to look back at it. Most of the important things in his life had worked that way, not chosen in advance, but entered into, then followed through, then understood in retrospect. He thought about what Cora had said at the kitchen table. Every morning you get up and you choose. He thought about Cal reading The Rock. He thought about Boone Mercer in the livery saying, "I almost said something, and then I didn't." He thought about Beckett riding into the draw with a folded paper in his coat, doing the thing that was harder because it was the right thing, without decoration or excuse. He thought about the specific courage of that, which was a different kind of courage than shooting, less legible but no less real. The trail ahead of him was open road 40 miles to the next town, the next job, the next set of tracks to read. His knee had another complaint coming by afternoon probably. The roan would want water by mid-morning. The envelope in his coat had enough in it for the next few months if he was careful, which he generally was. He was 51 years old, and he had no particular destination, and he had placed 12 holes through 12 silver dollars in front of 30 witnesses and done what he'd done in the dark of a saloon doorway, and found 62 cattle and written a letter that had reached a federal marshal and left a valley in a position that was better than he'd found it, none of which he'd planned, and all of which had been in their separate ways, the job. He rode south on the ridge road as the morning opened around him, the valley falling away behind him, the sky ahead clear and uncommitted, the roan's stride steady on the packed earth. Some men spent their lives looking for the thing they were supposed to be doing. He had never had that problem. The work found him, one trail at a time, each one leading to the next one, each one requiring everything he had and teaching him something he hadn't known he was learning until it was already part of him. That was enough. It had always been enough. Not everything, not the whole of what a man might want from a life, not the warm kitchen and the fixed pump and the boy in the yard learning the fence, but enough. More than nothing, and nothing was the alternative that the doorways and the dark and the 30 years of necessary accuracy had always been standing between him and. He kept his weight forward in the saddle. He read the ground ahead as it came. He rode on.